Okay, all right. Well, a very warm welcome to everyone, and thank you very much for joining joining our seminar. And I have to say that this is an interesting first, both for the British Journal of Community Justice, and I guess the first for the Criminal Justice Alliance, because this is our first joint seminar that we're holding together. And what we're trying to do by bringing our two organisations together really is to provide a way of presenting both policy and practice learning with research and kind of reflective learning, in this instance about restorative justice. So I'm very pleased, as I kind of have two kind of roles in this. One as the chair of the Criminal Justice Alliance, but also as the co-editor of the British Journal of Community Justice. So you can tell from the programme that we sent out, in effect, we've got the seminar in two phases, or two halves, as it were. So the first part of the seminar is going to be looking at policy and practice, and we've got Amal Ali from the Criminal Justice Alliance who's going to be speaking. And I have to say, as a slight change to the agenda, that Amal is taking Nina's place in talking about the CJA's kind of responding restoratively, to COVID report. And then we have Emily Thomas, who's the governor from HMP YOI ISIS. And then we've got Clifford Grimerson, and I hope I pronounced Clifford's surname correctly. I'm sure you'll kind of adjust that or tell me if I've got it wrong later on, Clifford, who's the Restorative Justice Lead for Her Majesty's Prison and Probation Service for Rehab, which is the kind of unit that's looking after that. And then we finish off this first phase, or first half, with Gary Shewan, who is a former assistant chief constable, who's going to talk about restorative policing and communities. And then when we finish that part, we've got what we're calling a research primer with Giuseppe Maglione from Edinburgh Napier University, before we then go into the break. But anyway, more of that to come. So let's get started. And just to start then with a very warm welcome to Amal, who's the policy officer from Criminal Justice Alliance. And over to you, Amal.
Thank you so much, Kevin. So I'm just waiting for my slides to be put up. Brilliant. Thank you so much. So I'm Amal Ali. I'm the policy officer at the Criminal Justice Alliance, or the CJA. So for those of you who might not be familiar with some of our work, the CJA is a network of organisations. So that's over 160 members who work right across the criminal justice pathway. That's everything from policing to prisons to resettlement and beyond. So we campaign for a more fairer and effective criminal justice system. So today I'm here to talk about our Responding Restoratively report to COVID-19, and it will be an overview of where we see some of the opportunities for restorative recovery in our criminal justice system. It will largely, like I say, focus on the report, but in the interests of time, it will be a bit of a whistle-stop tour. But I'm hoping that the other speakers will be able to give a bit more detail on some of the areas that I talk about. If you've not read the report, please do read it. I believe that Nina will be putting the link in the chat, and there's my email address if anybody wants to have a follow-up discussion. Please do get in touch. Next slide, please. Next slide. Brilliant. Thank you. So our Responding Restoratively report. So last summer we held a series of virtual meetings with some of our members to discuss the challenges that COVID-19 had brought to some of their work, some of the adaptations that they'd made. In addition to this, we'd also interviewed a number of restorative experts, and that's everything from practitioners to academics, to understand how restorative approaches could be used to better support the police, victims, people in prisons, families, and the wider community during COVID-19 and beyond. I also attended a series of brilliant virtual cuppers by Mutual Gain, and I guess we're lucky enough to have Gary with us today, and I look forward to hearing a bit more from him a little bit later. So following on from having these discussions with our members, speaking with experts, and then attending those virtual CUPPAs, I produced the Responding Restoratively report, which explored the potential of restorative approaches as a positive and effective response to the heightened tension in our society and in our criminal justice system during the pandemic and beyond. So I'll be highlighting some of the key findings from the report. But before moving on, I wanted to highlight our overarching recommendation, which is for a national strategy, or at least an action plan. So the last action plan for restorative justice ended in March 2018. So we would like to see a new strategy or an action plan, and for this to go further and run across both the Home Office and the Ministry of Justice, and not only look at restorative justice, but focus on more informal mediation and conflict resolution, such as restorative practice. Next slide, please. So restorative approaches and doing with. So I guess this is now beginning to think about how we move away from a system that's retributive and punitive to one that's more restorative. And I wanted to highlight this quote from the International Institute of Restorative Practitioners, which rightly highlights that we might be inclined to default to doing things to people and for people, but we need to be conscious when this is happening and make a conscious effort and a decision to step back into the with box and doing things with people as much as possible. And I guess a prime example of this is the management of COVID-19, where everything was very much command and control. And in stepping into the with box more, it really does require a cultural change. So moving away from single interventions or single practices, but consciously and continuously asking ourselves, how do we do things more restoratively, and seeing it as a way of working, then, like I say, a single intervention, and then thinking about how we win the hearts and minds of people when it comes to restorative approaches. Next slide, please. Restorative prisons and probation. So following on from the report's publication, we wrote to Dr. Jo Farrar, whose response is now published on our website. And she notes that Rehab is currently working to map and capture the experiences of HMPPS across recent decades in applying restorative approaches, including with prisoners' families and where there are mental health needs. And we have Clifford on the panel today, so I look forward to hearing a little bit more about this from him later. But in terms of the impact of COVID-19, I guess it's been devastating for everyone, but even more so with people who are in prison during this time. The impact on their mental health, increased isolation, anxiety, the suspension of social visits and not knowing what's really happening, and that limited contact with the outside world. So we know that violence during this time within prisons had actually reduced, and that's led to some people calling for less time out of cells in future. I guess whilst we do want to see this continuation of the low levels of violence within prison, it may be timely for us all now to consider what role restorative approaches and restorative justice can play in mitigating some of this risk, and to allow people and to facilitate, helping process some of that trauma that's been exacerbated by COVID-19. Another opportunity that we have is we are due to see the launch of the new probation service in June, which could again provide an opportunity for greater use of restorative justice and restorative practice. Next slide, please. So the use of technology was also another area that we explored in this report, and I think Ian's quote puts it very neatly, that there may be benefits to the online delivery of restorative justice, but this needs to be balanced with understanding that there will be this loss of energy that you get with face-to-face restorative justice interventions. And another expert that I'd interviewed had noted that some of the victims that they were working with disclosed actually feeling safer from doing this within the comfort of their own home, and that virtual restorative justice may open up opportunities to engage with new audiences, including young people, but also facilitating access for those who perhaps live in more remote areas, and even prisons if there was greater access to technology and virtual calls. Technology can also be used to help promote and raise awareness of restorative justice and restorative practice, which again goes back to that point around like cultural change and needing for people to be aware that what the difference is between restorative justice, restorative practice, and where we can be using this a bit more. And as we move, or as we see people moving to a more blended approach that might become the new normal, and the increased use of technology, we need to now carefully evaluate what is suitable to take place online and what needs to continue happening face to face. Next slide, please. So in terms of restorative policing, I wanted to highlight this brilliant piece of work that was undertaken by one of our members, Leaders Unlocked, who surveyed numerous young people living in England and Wales on their experiences of policing during the pandemic. So as you're all probably aware, temporary measures granting police the power to enforce lockdown restrictions were introduced, including the issuing of fixed penalty notices. And that's led to increased tensions and resulted in an emerging need to restore some of those relations. So the National Police Chiefs Council and the College of Policing suggested that fines were only to be enforced if individuals had failed to comply after officers had engaged with them, explained the risks to public health, and encouraged voluntary compliance. So essentially that enforcement should be a last resort. So this is referred to as the 4 E's approach. And as you'll see from the quote, some young people felt more positive about police interactions after police had applied the 4 E's approach, but not all experiences, unfortunately, had been positive, as you'll see from the second quote. Next slide, please. So in keeping with restorative policing, I also wanted to highlight another piece of work by another member of ours, Waimi, who held a virtual restorative listening forum where people could participate in dialogue and share their own experiences of racism from state bodies such as the police. This listening forum took place very shortly after the police killing of George Floyd over in the US and the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement here in the UK. And really, at that moment in time, there was heightened consciousness around the UK's criminal justice system, I guess, not being innocent and having its own history of institutional racism. And it is important to give people the safe space to speak about experiences that have been racist towards them and to feel that they've been heard. And that in itself can be a healing process, and restorative approaches can play a part in that. In essence, I think restorative policing is about how police engage with different communities, particularly communities that have had or have historically had and continue to have low levels of confidence in the police, especially young people and those from Black, Asian, and ethnic minority backgrounds. Next slide, please. So tackling the court backlog and out-of-court disposals. So as a lot of you might be aware who work in the criminal justice sector, COVID-19 has placed an exceptional pressure on our system, a system that was already under immense strain. So at the time of writing this report, courts in England and Wales were facing a backlog of up to 40,000 cases, and the prison population is predicted to rise to 90,000 and possibly over 95,000 by 2023 and 2024, which has led to increased calls to explore effective alternatives, including the greater use of out-of-court disposals. And the government's own sentencing white paper recognizes the value of restorative justice and the benefit that it brings to both the victim and the person who has been convicted of the crime. I mean, the recognition by the government in the sentencing white paper is a positive start, but without that action plan, without a clear outline of what the ambition is, it just risks being lost, unfortunately. Next slide, please. So this, the report did very briefly look at restorative practice with children and young people and families. Again, the impact of the pandemic on young people has exacerbated a lot of what we knew already. So there were existing issues in terms of the high levels of school exclusions, and now we see children returning to education after having missed out months and months of schooling, particularly if they didn't have digital access. So we've heard about the digital divide, and if they were living in an environment that was not conducive to studying or to learning. And the CJA's next briefing will be looking specifically at this issue on preventing the school to prison pipeline. And if you are doing work in this area, then I'd be really, really keen to hear from you. So please do reach out. Next slide, please. So this is my last slide, and I wanted to touch very briefly on community cohesion and empowerment. And I guess it's how we now think about how do we restore some of that power that organizations and parts of the criminal justice system hold back to communities and empower them to co-produce some of the solutions to our problems. So we already have restorative cities, we have restorative communities, we have neighborhood watch panels, we have scrutiny panels looking at police powers. So in some ways, we have members of the community already involved in our criminal justice system and processes, but in a lot of ways we don't. And there might be further opportunity for this to happen, for example, through unpaid and reparation work. But recently we have published a briefing for prospective police and crime commissioners, and we have found good examples of commissioners co-producing action plans and police and crime plans and involving people with lived experience of the criminal justice system. And this is something that we'd like to see more of. And in the current process, in the current stage of where we are, this roadmap out of the pandemic, we see a lot of people and a lot of organizations reassessing how they do their work. And it again is an opportunity for us to think about how we restore and how we give back some of that power. And I guess it goes back to that earlier point that I was making as well, about doing things with people rather than to people, and just being conscious of when we are doing that and that not becoming the default. And that is the end of my slide. Thank you so much.
That's great. Many thanks for that, Amal. I think if we can probably just have the slides taken off, that's great. So yeah, thanks a lot for Amal. I'm sure that that some of those points as you raised will be kind of picked up by our other speakers who are coming up. But also, if you've got any questions, just do add them to the chat, and we'll pick them up as they go through. Okay. Well, thanks so much for that presentation, Amal. I'm sure we'll come back to you later. Any questions that people have got, please put them on the chat, and we'll pick them up later. So now I'd like to turn to our next speaker, and a very warm welcome to Emily Thomas, who's the governor at HMP YOI ISIS. And Emily's going to talk about initiatives that she saw set up, restorative justice initiatives within the prison. So over to you, Emily.
Thanks very much. And it's really good to be here today, and lovely to speak to everybody. I thought that I would try and focus on a couple of things really today. The first is the pandemic, and thinking about the opportunities and the experiences during the pandemic, which I think might have some uses to us as we move forward, and the other is then to think about existing initiatives and opportunities to extend and expand the use of some of those initiatives in the future. I was thinking very much about the idea of a restorative prison and what that might look like in practice, and what we could learn from the very from what we've had to do during the pandemic in order to save lives within prison, and what that might mean for how we deliver within prisons in future times. And I was very kind of caught by the idea that really prison governors are responsible for creating an environment within their prisons which is conducive to allowing interventions and ways of working and rehabilitation of individuals to flourish. And often that's a real challenge, because prison environments are a challenge. And also the way that we have traditionally over the years developed those prison regimes can also be a frustration when it comes to delivering particular interventions and ideas. But the main idea, the main thing that prison governors are responsible for, I think, and without which no real rehabilitation can take place, is to create an environment in prisons which feels safe, both to the prisoners and the staff who work there. And too often, I think, over the time that I've worked in the prison service, we haven't been able to deliver an environment which has made prisoners feel as safe as they could, and that has limited our ability to provide a rehabilitative or a restorative environment. What we've seen during the pandemic, albeit with incredibly restricted regimes, has been changes and certainly in terms of violence, reductions in levels of violence across the prison estate. And prison governors, not just me, I think, are already thinking about what has contributed, aside from the fact that those regimes were limited in the amount of time that prisoners spent out of their cells, which has contributed to that reduction of violence, and what can we learn about what has contributed to it moving forward. In addition to, you know, kind of clear statistical reductions in levels of violence, certainly what we've seen at ISIS and what I've had fed back to me by staff here is that in unlocking prisoners in smaller groups and spending time with prisoners in smaller groups, they've been able to establish better relationships with those prisoners, that the opportunities for helpful conversations, for building and establishing relationships with trust at the centre of them has been greatly improved. And prison officers' ability simply to do things for prisoners which meet the requirements of, you know, meeting their kind of basic needs has been greatly improved as well. Because actually, if you're only trying to kind of fix the problems of 15 prisoners within an hour and a half, you're far more likely to succeed than if you're trying to fix the problems of 75 prisoners within the same time frame. And I think it won't just be me within the prison system who is seeing the opportunities of trying to think about how, whilst improving the amount of time that prisoners are out of their cells, and whilst ensuring that prisoners can engage in good, purposeful activity, how we capitalise on the things that we have seen really have some positive impact during the pandemic. And that idea of supporting prisoners and working with prisoners in smaller groups, and not exposing prisoners to the levels of fear so many of them have when they're in much larger groups, seems to me like a really logical thing to try and explore. It's pretty hard. The logistics of managing, you know, what are generally quite big prisons in smaller household groups causes all kinds of complications in terms of how do you kind of get people the level of access they need to services and to education and to workshops and all of those things. But it strikes me that it's kind of worth the effort if what we can create is an environment within a prison which is fundamentally safe, and in which prisoners feel safe enough that they have the headspace, the bandwidth, the whatever, to then be able to take on board the opportunities and the interventions that we can then deliver. Because I think then we'll see that they'll be more successful. And I think the other bit of changing prison environments and thinking about looking after prisoners in smaller, perhaps more household groups, is that it can then change your perspective about exactly how interventions, what we mean by interventions and what they look and feel like. So I think the tradition over the last, you know, I've been in the prison service 20 odd years, but certainly in kind of my career in the service, has been that interventions are delivered by people other than prison officers, and they are delivered elsewhere than the wing on which the prisoner lives. And that kind of process, one, leads to lots of movement needing to happen within a prison to get people to the right place to have an intervention delivered by a person who's also had to get through the gate to get to you. But it's also meant that prison officers are the recipients of prisoners who've had an intervention without necessarily feeling engaged in the intervention themselves, or that they have any ownership of the kind of pre and post support of a prisoner who's undergoing any kind of work by somebody else. And I think that what we can do, if we really think carefully about how we want to work post pandemic, is how do actually we have much more of a focus of interventions happening on wings, with the engagement of prison officers, and with prison officers as a much more integral part of that. Because what we do know is that prisoners in prison will see their prison officers more than they will see anybody else, and that the relationship that's being had between prison officers and prisoners will have the most impact on a prisoner's experience of prison, and I think on the efficacy of any kind of rehabilitative effort. Because if it's all being undermined by staff, it won't work. If it's being enhanced and supported by staff, it's likely to be much better embedded, and it's likely to be much more long lasting. And I think, given the almost blank piece of paper we will be left with post COVID, we can really start to think more creatively. So at ISIS, for example, we're thinking about, we've got some good empirical evidence that actually for a considerable number of young men, they are engaging better with education when they are doing it on their own in their cell, with support from a teacher coming into them a couple of times a week, than they were when we were trying to send them to a maths class they didn't want to go to, where they were under pressure from their peers not to engage with it, and where they were fearful that they would, you know, they would see somebody they didn't want to see, or they would inadvertently get themselves into trouble, or advertently often. And if we carry that on, you know, if we take that kind of model and say, well, if it works with education, it's likely to potentially work with other things. And actually, you know, maybe that means we can move away from a target for education, which is about bums on seats and about how full are your classrooms, and say, actually, you can judge us on our delivery based on outcomes for individual prisoners. And we can say to prisoners, do you know what, you need to take ownership of the fact you haven't got level 2 maths. You know, here's the resources to do it, here's the support to do it, but we're not going to be standing over you, you know, saying, right, you know, it's 9 o'clock, today's maths. we're going to say, this is your period of time to do this, and the quicker you do it, the quicker you'll be able to get into the barbering workshop, or the other fun things that we do. And I think that kind of idea, it sits across all interventions, and I think, I might be wrong, but I think that feels restorative to me. I think that feels like a way of working, and a way of engaging with prisoners, which becomes less about us telling them what they must do, and instead having a more sensible dialogue about what we think they should perhaps do, and what would they want to do, and how do they want to do it, and working with them to meet those where they want to be, rather than trying to kind of fit everybody into the kind of shoe boxes of what we have on offer, and kind of punishing people who won't go and don't want to do things in a particular way. And if we can get that kind of thinking into the regime and into the delivery, then I think we can also get that kind of thinking into relationships between staff and prisoners, and we can start to have an environment which is safe, and which allows interventions to flourish, and we can have a staff group which is engaged in that delivery and has a far more personal relationship with prisoners, where they know and are supportive of what the prisoners on their wing are aiming for, and we can use that to embed that idea of restoration, and do it in a way which isn't just us kind of bolting on a restorative intervention as an afterthought, and then wondering why it doesn't work, but actually making it part of the fabric of what's being delivered within a prison environment. I'm sounding really ambitious because we've been having a pandemic, and that has been so challenging, but I think it has also given us an opportunity to really think, and we should seize that opportunity and see whether we can do something really, really amazing with it.
That's
Thank you.
Great, Emily. So I think just one thing I just wanted to mention, because time's almost up, but I know, for example, of course, that you kind of involved RJ practitioners, brought them into the prison, as it were. Just wonder if you just talk a little bit about that, because I know that Charlotte Colkin is working with yourselves there. Yeah.
Yeah, so we have worked for several years now with Belong, and I can see Esther as well on here. So we've been doing conciliation and restorative practice with Belong for a number of years, with real success, and I think Belong is a really good example of where we have embedded that into delivery in the prison, and Belong practitioners work alongside prison officers, work alongside prisoners to really focus on how do we deliver with young violent men who are often in conflict with each other, how do we try and resolve those conflicts with them by engaging with them in a restorative way, and we can point to real kind of examples of across the years of where that's worked well. And then Charlotte is new into the prison, but we're building on work we've done with Belong, but thinking about how do you engage prison officers and small groups of prisoners in circles of restorative conversations, and develop the skills for prisoners and for staff about how do you have conversations which are positive and which lead somewhere, and which help you to achieve really positive ends. And we're at the beginning of the journey with Charlotte, but so far the enthusiasm of both staff and prisoners has been really beneficial. And I think the way we're working with Charlotte is kind of what I've just been saying, which is we're doing it on a spur. We're doing it with the prison officers who work on that spur, and then they will work with the prisoners, on the spur to deliver the course. And I think that's the sort of model I'm looking for moving forward.
No, that's really helpful. Thanks for that, Emily. And obviously, we'll hear from Charlotte a little bit later on in the kind of later session. But thanks for your input now, and we'll have some questions for you later on, no doubt. And I just encourage people in the chat just to kind of, if you've got any questions, please do put them on, and then they will move shortly, I think, to a presentation from, I think it's going to be Clifford next. So thanks so much, Emily. Thanks for your input.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thanks. Over to Gary, who's been waiting very patiently to give his talk. Over to you, Gary, and a very warm welcome.
Thank you, Kevin. Can we just confirm you see the slides, everybody? Somebody?
Yeah.
That's great. Thank you, Kevin.
Yeah.
Okay, just a little bit of introduction for those who don't know me. I spent 31 years as a police officer here in the UK. But after about 16 years of policing, I was lucky enough to find myself at Cambridge, and I got myself entrenched in the whole investigation around reintegrative shaming, and I came away really inspired by that. I was very lucky to go over to Northern Ireland and look at how restorative justice was working in a community setting. I know we've got Tim Chapman on this call today, and also Peter Wolf, who's also on the call, so it really inspired me as well. And I suppose restorative justice sort of got into my blood at that particular point, even though perhaps it was unusual to see that within a policing leader. And it probably stays with you for life. It seems to have stayed with me, and I think it's going to stay with me in terms of this for life. There's no doubt about that. I spent the next 11 years as the National Police Chief Council lead for restorative justice, working with the Home Office and the Ministry of Justice. I was a trustee of the Restorative Justice Council. I retired a couple of years ago. I spend half my week now working with an organisation called Mutual Gain, working around community engagement and community development, and half my week working at Liverpool John Moores University at the Centre for Advanced Policing Studies. So I love this opportunity to nip back in, so a huge thank you for the opportunity to speak here today. I don't need to tell you, I suppose, the business case or why restorative justice works. You know that. You know, you're all on this call, and you're probably great supporters of restorative justice. But I suppose I do need to remind you that, you know, despite all the optimism, and Clifford there shared a load of optimism there, and the criminal justice system in this country still doesn't work. It just does not work. And we still find ourselves in a position whereby we have a revolving door position in relation to crime and offending. And, you know, for me, I think we've been looking for, and I think I agree with Clifford when he says, I don't yet think we found our moment. I think we've been looking for that paradigm shift that really says that, you know, enough's enough and we need to do something and change something very differently. So for me, for somebody who spent so long in terms of policing, the opportunity to think about how do we make that leap, how do we make that change in terms of a real change in the criminal justice sector is a really important question. And, you know, from an organization, you know, which I represented for a long time in terms of policing, this was a very bold statement a couple of years ago from the National Police Chiefs Council. It was something that may seem obvious to you, it was certainly sound obvious to me. But when you get the National Police Chiefs Council actually stating that you can't arrest your way out of a crisis, I think you are really beginning to see the legacy of us all working together to try and get that paradigm shift. But the problem is, in terms of policing, that isn't necessarily a universal view in terms of the policing industry. There are many within policing, including police leaders in the UK, who still believe that actually you can arrest, you can change the crime position through law enforcement. But a single agency response to crime just doesn't work. We all know that. You know, we go back to the same places, the same families, the same, you know, same locations time and time again. And the stark reality is that crime doesn't just happen because people choose to be bad. Crime happens for a whole range of complex reasons. And unless you try and understand what those complex reasons are, unless you're prepared to involve yourself in dialogue about that, then using law enforcement is very much a blunt tool. And I think that's something that which is very clear. I probably was too optimistic going back 10, 15 years. I was too optimistic and genuinely believed that I could lead a restorative justice campaign in policing. We were going to change, you know, we were going to change the criminal justice system. And I'd spent a long time trying to find a way of using restorative practice within the policing environment. And there were some great successes, and there's no doubt about it that we did manage to change thinking. But the stark reality is that policing and restorative justice doesn't necessarily fit together, and there's no easy paradigm shift in putting restorative practice as part of a toolkit in terms of policing. And unfortunately, what we saw over a number of years and I think Clifford there talked about the dilution. I often talk about the McDonaldization of restorative justice. And restorative justice began to be, in many ways, and I use the word abused by policing, to deal with low-level crime less formally, and as a result of which, the whole ethos and the theoretical belief around restorative justice began to become watered down. Community involvement became less and less. And then the stark reality is, it's often found that police officers make very poor restorative facilitators. They find it really hard to, in many regards, sort of shift their culture in terms of their thinking to become listeners when they're so used to be dominating in terms of a dominating role, and that's very much one of the reasons why it failed. Police officers are often too judgmental. They try to reinvestigate rather than listening and trying to focus on repairing harm. And the Home Office recognized that itself and said that, that workplace cultures often undermine those efforts to implement restorative justice in the criminal justice system. And therefore, this sort of conference and today's discussion is really timely, because despite all the really progress that's been made, particularly in prisons, there is still a requirement to change hearts and minds in terms of the criminal justice system to really embed a restorative approach in there. But communities continue to be harmed, and despite what we've had in the last 15 months in terms of this really strange 15 months, communities still are harmed by crime. Communities are exploited by crime. They're traumatized by crime, and often we underplay the trauma that communities find when crime and antisocial behaviour is very prevalent in a locality. But what we do know is that the risk of exploitation, the risk of trauma is greater where there is low social capital, low resilience, and low citizen involvement. So if you have a criminal justice system that doesn't invest in community social capital, doesn't invest in citizen involvement in the solutions, then you are in some ways constantly perpetrating the danger that communities feel in relation to what crime brings them. And from a very clear point of view, no matter how much funding, no matter how much policing, no matter how much innovation you put into a community, the impact in terms of reduced crime or improved standards of living will be short-lived if the policing effort doesn't secure the cooperation and support of those communities. And therefore, what we have all found in the last 15 months is that we are seeing communities talking more, greater dialogue, exploiting new types of technology to be able to communicate with each other. But if we go back to a criminal justice process, or if we go back to a policing system that is not involving and getting support from communities, then we just get ourselves back onto a cycle of harm. And I think that's really important for us to be able to recognize. And for me, community-led solutions, aren't just a one-off. They shouldn't be just there to deal with a particular type of problem. Community-led solutions are the ones that really deliver the best outcomes in our society. Wherever you look, whether it's violence, whether it's gun crime, whether it's drugs, whatever it is, where you get the criminal justice system working hand in hand with local communities, you will get better outcomes delivered into those communities. And the criminal justice system has got to, in some ways, embrace that understanding and tackle in some way the complex challenge to their professionalism or to their importance, to be able to recognize that actually what we have to have is a criminal justice system that is a more collaborative and empowering criminal justice system. And we just, I don't even have to talk through that second bullet point there. But if we work restoratively, if we work in a collaborative way in our communities, The outcomes aren't just about reduced crime, isn't just about reduced offending. It is about better communication. It's about reduced exclusions in schools. It's about improving relationships. Restorative practice touches all of those issues in our communities, but without a embedded collaborative approach, none of that will really be happening. And for me, you know, thinking about this, what we really have to do is strongly focus upon the goals that we set out there. You know, we have to get leaders, we have to get strategic owners, whether that's a Home Office, whether it's a Ministry of Justice, to really buy into the goal of restorative practice, to be able to ensure that we not just educate the public, but we involve the public. The search for reparation, the search for reducing harm, is exactly the same search in terms of reducing offending. And I think that for me is one of the most important things that we have to focus on. And I just want to just sort of finish off just saying a little bit about restorative policing. I believe that the gearing effect when you police in a community, when you have their support and involvement, is significant. You don't just get, you know, the return on your investment in terms of policing, you get so much more. And facilitating that blended approach whereby law enforcement sits alongside community partnerships has got to be at the heart of a criminal justice system committed to restorative practice. Whilst we've all been, over the last 15 months, for example, really focusing upon working closer together in communication, we also have to think about what have the police service been doing. In many regards, the police service have not had to embrace different levels of communication. And we've already heard some examples in the report, what I call law policing. Law policing is where the police-only agencies go out and use law enforcement as a tool to tackle criminality. And that for me is in summary, we've all seen examples of that over the last 15 months. There hasn't been the embedding of a collaborative approach. What the criminal justice system, what policing has to aim for, is what I call high policing. Policing in partnership, policing in a collaborative way, policing using value-led discretion. That is what high policing is, and high policing is really going to deliver the solutions we're looking at. The police service has just introduced the professionalisation agenda, and this gives us a real opportunity for the police officers of the future to really embrace that concept of high policing, more collaborative approach, better understanding around crime and criminality. So I think I'm quite positive looking forward, but I do think there is still a long way to go. And earlier we talked about a strategy and said it's time for a new strategy. And perhaps I'll leave you with what I consider to be my view of what that strategy looks like. And it has to be outcome focused. It has to be integrated across all the criminal justice systems. But most importantly, it has to involve community, different entry points, because the police service may not be the most restorative in terms of its delivery of its outcomes, but it is an incredibly important gatekeeper to the criminal justice system. And more active and resilient communities is at the heart of great restorative practice. If we really want to see restorative communities in the UK, then we have to get a criminal justice system that involves high-level policing, collaborative policing, that really believe in wanting to change the outcomes and not just using law enforcement as a tool. Happy to share these slides. I'm more than happy. I think I've spoken my 10 minutes there, so I'm going to bring that to an end. And I just want to say, you know, finally in departure here is, I take Clifford's view that we haven't yet seen our time in terms of restorative practice, but I think what we should do is use this post-COVID opportunity to be able to ensure that as we all move forward, we ask our senior leaders and we ask those in charge of policy to continually to find new ways of involving communities in not just the delivery of outcomes, but also the design of products. And I think policing is no different to that. And I think there's a real hope that the policing of the future tomorrow is far more community focused, far more restorative focused, and far more likely to be able to achieve the right outcomes. And thank you. Cheers. Thanks for this time.
Great. Many thanks for that. Excuse me. And thanks to all our speakers thus far for their input, which has been really helpful in kind of exploring some of the issues we currently face, but also I think providing us with a good starting point to maybe pick up some questions. So I'm going to try and pick them from the chat and sort of I'll take them from the chat, but I'll sort of take them kind of in order, I think, in which they appeared. So I think the first question, I think, is one from Peter Salami. It kind of goes to you, Emily. So I think the question that he had was, since RJ is voluntary, how does that link with the rate of completion of interventions?
Yeah, so I think I sort of vaguely touched upon this. I think there's a real opportunity to move away from such a kind of target focused approach to interventions, and to, you know, ideally you would tailor the work you did to an individual prisoner, and instead of kind of just putting them in boxes of they need TSP, they need resolve, they need, you know, whatever, that actually you think much more carefully about responding to what they how they want to do things, and move that forward. I mean, I would really hope that you know, we can move away from just kind of thinking about, you need, you know, there is a target for this, and into what are the individual needs of the population and how do we best meet them, because I think that is the best way to embed things that we think work, to be responsive to those needs. I mean, it's a massive challenge in a prison, but you know, in a prison like mine with 600 prisoners, that's exactly what we're thinking of doing, is how do you create an individual progress plan for an individual young man from the point at which they arrive with you to cover their sentence, responding to their particular needs and wants.
That's great. Okay, I hope that answers, I think, Peter's question. Just a quick one on terms of the presentations we've seen so far, and also any presentations that may come later on in the second half. We'll have them, collect them together, and we'll email them to everyone who's registered for the event today. So you'll kind of get them in the next day or so. I think there are a couple of questions on the chat for, I think, addressed to you, Gary. So the first one is from Faye Hayden Island. And the question is, where do you feel better understanding support of neurological conditions such as ADHD, a pathological demand avoidance and oppositional defiance disorder fit into school exclusions, and B, school avoidance completion rates? I think that's one for you, and maybe also something that Amal can come in on as well. But first to you, Gary.
Yes, I mean, the great thing about restorative interventions is that it is a really progressive tool, but it also, I think there's another question on about sort of how do you convince institutions to use restorative practice when it's not favoured by everybody. And I think, but the other great thing about being a progressive tool, it also you know, it meets the conservative needs of people who look at offending and harm as well. Because, you know, it's you know, standing up for your own responsibility is an essential part of a restorative practice. But, you know, the fact it's progressive does mean that, you know, that sort of when you deliver restorative practice in a school environment or in a community environment, you have to have the opportunity to research and understand the rationale or why offending happened in the first place. Where you have where you try to roll restorative practice out quickly and in volume, then you miss the opportunity to look at conditions like ADHD and other you know, disorders, because what you see is you see the act of offending rather than necessarily, you know, the rationale for offending or the reasons or an understanding of why someone may have harmed somebody else. So the progression of restorative practice is ensuring that, and Clifford talked about, you know, sort of core commissioning. Restorative practice should always be core commissioned, because we don't all bring all the skills required to be able to deliver really good restorative outcomes. You do need people to understand, you know, the reasons and rationale and the understanding around behavioural conditions, but that you also need an understanding about the harm that's been affected by a community or by an individual. And then you also need the understanding around how this person fits within the criminal justice system and, you know, looking forward. So, restorative practice isn't easy because, to really be able to be able to make a difference to people's lives, you do have to co-commission, you do have to bring in skills and expertise to be able to get there. And often I find that where restorative practice either has, I won't use the word failed, but where restorative practice just hasn't succeeded as much as it could have done, or where it's perhaps blown itself out and it's sort of, its popularity has fallen down. It's because we are trying to do it too quickly, or we're trying to do it in a standard way. There is no standard approach to restorative practice. It's all about tailoring to individual needs, and I think that's exactly where we find ourselves. I don't know whether Mal's got anything to add in terms of that behavioural condition, but for me, it is about focusing on individual needs.
Mal, did you want to come in on that? I mean, I think the CJA is going to produce something about schools, I think, and restorative.
Yeah.
Is that right? Yeah.
So we're actually hoping, as part of our Responding Restoratively series, to do the next one on the school to prison pipeline and how restorative approaches can be fed into that. I mean, yeah, there are great examples of schools working in restorative ways, but often it's primary schools and it's not in secondary schools.
Right.
And that's where we know the school to prison pipeline exists. So yeah, I'd like to see more focus on that.
Can I just add to that, sorry, with the behavioural aspect of it? I'm a parent to a child with all three of those conditions. And I also run a youth club where there's a lot of young people in the youth club with those conditions, and you can see their pathway already, unfortunately, because they are misunderstood and misdealt with. So I think they operate on a certain level of diminished responsibility because of their neurological conditions. And we would look at that in so many ways in maybe the adult world as a defence in any criminality. But there is definitely a diminished responsibility there, because the way they behave often, and their behaviour is a presentation of the level of anxiety, distress and trauma that they're feeling at any given moment. Understanding the reasons, the factors that feed into that anxiety, addressing those will change the behaviour. So often we focus on changing the behaviour without understanding what's actually driving the behaviour, what is actually the root cause of that behaviour, which is because of the anxiety. And that's just a key area of focus that I think needs to be included as maybe a subsection of restorative practice in terms of root cause analysis, in terms of why the people end up in, or how the people end up in that point in the first place. Thank you.
So, thanks for that, Faye. I mean, maybe something that the CGA might pick up on in terms of the work that they do. I'm just picking up on another question, again related to schools, I think, and this one again for Gary. So this is from Gavin Bailey, and the question is, how does, I guess, RJ fit with some of the public demands or media demands for justice to be seen to be done? And he's saying that, for example, in schools, you might want a restorative approach. And he's referring to rights respecting schools, and some parents may be in favour of it, but other parents and high-profile arguments are made that there should be a path between, say, bullying and exclusion, and if a bully is not excluded, then might maybe regarded as failure. Gary?
Yeah, I think this gets down to the crux of the matter in terms of how you embed restorative practice within a wider approach, because whether it's in a school, whether it's in a community, whether it's in a prison, what you have to do is be able to say, what's the purpose? What's the purpose of this school? What's the purpose of this community? What are the values that this community or this prison or this school embraces? What are the goals that we're seeking to achieve? When you try and apply restorative practice in a geographic or an institutional setting, without it embedding within the values or the understanding of the goals and expectations and priorities of that institution or geography, then restorative justice then finds itself being liked by some and disliked by others, and it becomes a little bit of a football. What you have to do in terms of, if you're thinking about using restorative practice in an institution or in a location, you have to invest the time in understanding what is it this community wants to achieve. What are its goals? Does it want less crime? Does it want less school exclusions? Does it want more self-respecting, sort of conversations? Does it want greater trust? Does it want better, and long-standing relationships? And then you use your restorative approaches to be able to help deliver those outcomes. The difficulty files is when you try to use restorative practice to deal with harm or with offending without an understanding about how it's going to contribute to a wider set of outcomes, really. So for me, again, it just demonstrates to me that restorative practice doesn't happen in a vacuum. It can't happen as a add-on in terms of a process. It has to be delivered based upon an understanding of what you're trying to achieve in the first place.
Okay, thanks, Peter. I mean, there's some interesting kind of comments, I guess, on the chat. I mean, there's a comment here from Domina, who's just be kind of saying that they don't quite understand how policing intervention can be part of a solution. And I think the comment there is that policing part of a systemic problem, and that maybe RJ policing may be a contradiction. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, and you know, we've all been sat in our homes or our offices over the last 12 months, and we've seen countless evidence that policing is part of a problem, a systemic problem. You know, racism still exists. Disproportionality in our criminal justice system is probably getting higher, not lower. We have seen, you know, abuse of powers. We've seen continued lethal force being used. You know, we all looked in, you know, astounded at some of the policing tactics that have been used, even in the UK, in relation to COVID. So there's no doubt about it that, you know, that the policing puts itself constantly in a position whereby, you know, community policing or restorative policing or contributing to a overall goal seems a bit of a contradiction, because yes, there is a ample evidence that policing structures and policing systems in the UK are part of a problem. But you know, just because something is part of a problem doesn't mean you can't transform it. You can't bring about new ways of working. You can't, you know, you can't change attitudes. You can't change culture. And you know, we have to start somewhere. And that's when I was trying to talk about the difference to what I call low policing and high policing. If we allow low policing to be the dominant policing style in the UK, then policing is part of the problem. But if we invest in working in a collaborative way, if we invest in giving police the understanding of why crime happens, if we invest in some of the joint commissioning work that it should, you know, it used to go on in terms of probation and policing, for example, then we give ourselves the opportunity to lift up into what I call high policing. And high policing uses discretion wisely. It is less enforcement orientated, and it is part of a community solution. But we get what we allow, and you know, this Criminal Justice Alliance, everybody on this call, you all have a voice. You know, next week or this week, next week, we're all voting for our police and crime commissioners. Have we looked at what the police and crime commissioners in the UK are saying about using restorative practice, what that style of policing might look like? So, you know, we have to use our power wisely, and we have to use this argument. So I understand the comment from Domina in relation to a contradiction, but contradictions have been demonstrated in the past to be able to turn around, and I'm sure we can again.
Okay, I mean, just picking up on that, I mean, I think the stuff about policing and RJ seems to be picking up quite a few comments. So there's another comment here, I think, from Bridget Hansel, which mentions about the Brookings Institute had a forum on policing in the US and noted that the presence of a warrior mentality imbued in police training and recruitment attracts a subset of individuals who may not be the best fit to deal with a more collaborative model of policing. And I think the question there was, how do you filter these individuals out or change that? I think you've sort of addressed it a little bit with some of that. I think, Gary, some things you've said. I don't know if you want to come back on that a little bit. Or...
Sorry, I feel sorry for the other two speakers. I mean, so Clifford, Emily, jump in. But yes, I mean, absolutely right. There is, you know, the police culture, warrior mentality is absolutely alive and kicking, and we've all seen that. The police education qualifications framework. You know, I now teach police officers of the future, and you know, one of my goals, one of my evaluation strategy is to try and ensure that there are other cultural aspects of policing other than warrior mentality. about understanding, about more, using communication skills, about being able to invest in elements of policing that sort of works in a more collaborative and partnership approach. So I think I think police service is trying to change the warrior mentality. It's not going to happen quickly. But again, we are able, with investment and with change, to be able to bring this about. Okay, so I've got 5 minutes left before we need to move on to the next little kind of phase of today's seminar. So I'm just got to go to Emily. I think is still there. Just that, and this is just a kind of pickup from something you mentioned, Gary. I think I think JD suggested in the chat that prison context may invite similar cultural training attitude to that expressed around the police. And I don't know if you have thoughts on that, Emily, very quickly.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely real similarities, and I think we've got to think within the prison service about where we put emphasis within our training. Sure. So, for example, prison officers, absolutely have to have compulsory control and restraint training every year, so they use the appropriate techniques when force has to be used. But actually, we don't have similar compulsory training necessarily alongside that focus on use of force, which is compulsory around de-escalation, around how do you avoid having to use that force in the first place, and perhaps not enough thought within the organisation about how you effectively train and upskill people to be able to do the work upstream of conflict, of issues arising, so that actually use of force is always a last resort. So I think there's absolutely an opportunity, and then I think that spreads into emphasising. I think prison service recruitment, prison officer recruitment really does emphasise the right things in terms of what we're looking for and qualities of a prison officer, but we don't always reflect that as well in the cultures that new prison officers then walk into in prisons. And we've got to do better to make the realities of the adverts that we have on the telly and in the media be what actually being a prison officer does feel like once you get here. And I think that is there's real similarities between the police and prison officers in terms of the quality and amount of training that is given to understanding and recognising the particular needs of individual prisoners and being able to take those things into account when being asked to do what is a really difficult thing. And I think I didn't talk about in my talk, but one of the things that I'm really that we're just about to introduce here is reflective practice for prison officers, to give them the space to be able to talk and reflect about the experiences they have each day, so that actually we're able to upskill them so that they can upskill prisoners in being able to have those really successful conversations about how each of them change their behaviours.
Great, thanks, Emily. So I think I'm going to bring this particular section or part of the seminar just to a close there, just to say that what we will do, because I think some useful comments and some links there on the chat, that we'll save the chat after the event, and we'll share that with you as well, along with the slides that people will be using today. So we'll send that out to you, everyone who's registered for the event. So onto our kind of bridge between here and the next session after, which is well, when I say we, it was kind of more me, called it a research primer. So I'd like to welcome Giuseppe Maglione, who's a lecturer at Edinburgh Napier University, who's going to give a presentation or talk about I think the key findings from the paper that he wrote for the British Journal of Community Justice special RJ issue. And at some point in the chat, I think either myself or colleague Anton or Gavin will kind of put the link into that special issue in the chat so you can have a look at it. Not quite sure where you are actually, Giuseppe, but yeah, okay, all right. I can see you. Great. Well, welcome, Giuseppe. So we've still got 10 minutes for your presentation, then 5 minutes for questions. So over to you. And a warm welcome to you.
Thank you very much indeed. I will be now sharing my screen. Could you please confirm you see my screen?
Yeah, we can see that.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. That's really great. So basically what I'd like to do over the next 10 minutes is to talk about what we have been talking about so far in the seminar, but from a slightly different perspective. So the institutionalization of restorative justice. This is what I'm interested in. By institutionalization, I mean basically the process of restorative justice becoming an actual option, a publicly recognized option for dealing with crime, behaviors defined as crimes and their consequences. When I say public recognition, I'm particularly interested in policy recognition of restorative justice. So my focus is on policymakers, and particularly penal policymakers, appropriating restorative justice. This phenomenon, so more penal laws on restorative justice, is very much on the rise. It has been on the rise over the last 20 years or so. This slide refers to the United States, and it's a very recent survey from Talia Gonzalez, which says basically one thing, that over the last 20 years, the number of penal laws on restorative justice, or we probably would be more accurate to say the number of penal regulations on restorative justice, has increased from 20 in 2000 to 240. Regulation, I mean individual norms up to entire laws dedicated to restorative justice. And here we are talking of statutory laws, so state laws in the United States. And now in the United States, 50 states have regulations on restorative justice. Now, this phenomenon, so policymakers appropriating and legislating on restorative justice, has been, I think, embraced by large sections of the restorative justice movement as something good, a symptom of success of restorative justice, or at least something necessary, because it enables the development of restorative justice in terms of, for instance, capacity, in terms of funding, in terms of provision. Now, what I'd like to propose you is a few objections to this. I think instead that there should be some doubts or some caution in approaching handing over restorative justice to policymakers. And the reason why we should ask what happens to restorative justice when policymakers, penal policymakers, appropriate restorative justice, I think is justified by the fact that at least originally, historically, restorative justice was crafty practices, very marginal practices, which to some extent were a challenge or were meant to be a challenge to criminal justice values, aims, and goals. This, I think, justifies the question, what happens to RJ when policymakers get their hand on it? My answer to this question is that something bad happens. This something bad is basically the fact that some of the values characterizing restorative justice, what I believe are the best values of restorative justice, or the most progressive values within restorative justice, get to some extent neutralized. So these values which get kind of lost in translation from practice to policy are what I call the radical core of restorative justice. And what do I mean by that? Which are these values? Some of them have been also raised, I think, during the previous presentations. For instance, that restorative justice is not a matter of professionalizing, but it's a matter of bottom-up type of practice, deprofessionalized. The informality of restorative justice, the fact is about empowering stakeholders, the fact that it's decentralized or community-based, as someone else said, and the fact that there's a non-violent type of justice, which fits also with the idea of critique of punishment. Now, what I'm going to do now is to give you a few examples of policymakers appropriating restorative justice, really snapshots. And I apologize for the lack of nuances, but I think it gives an idea of what happens to restorative justice when policymakers, penal policymakers, appropriate this thing. So this is from England and Wales, and I guess you're all a bit familiar with these two pieces of legislation. So in the Crime and Court Act 2013 and the Offender Rehabilitation Act 2014, what is restorative justice? Well, it's something, it's not clear what this something is, but it is about victims and offenders It is about maximizing, this is the aim of restorative justice, maximizing the offender awareness of the effect of the offending, and it's about giving victims an opportunity to talk about how the crime has impacted on them. Another example of policymaking, penal policymaking and restorative justice is from Norway, 2014, a new law or a new amendment of a very old law on restorative justice. This new law introduces a new penal measure called youth monitoring and follow-up. It is a criminal sanction. It's a punishment, type of punishment. This is the way it's been defined by the same legislation. And among the other things, this new law introduces a new professional figure, youth coordinators, which basically are the restorative practitioners in the specific context for young people. And among the other things, these youth coordinators have the power to significantly restrict the young person freedom, for instance, prohibiting alcohol or narcotic substances. Another example, 2014, France, this time, the law on the individualization of punishment, which introduced formally restorative justice in the French criminal justice system. New penal sanction called penal restraint, defined by the French legislator as the legal framework for restorative justice. It is a type of community punishment, and within this framework, restorative justice is about obligations to repair the consequences of a crime. In case of breach, you go back to the standard track, being this post-sentence standard track means punishment. So what kind of restorative justice shines through how legislators in this different context understand restorative justice? So, well, the language is the language of criminal justice. So it's a language which it doesn't really connect people. It's a language which separates. It is about new penal sanctions. It is about, there are no communities here. While instead criminal justice gatekeepers are in full control. It is about new professionals, and it's about, keeping control, retaining control within the criminal justice system. I think there's much more which shines through, for instance, probably net widening and things like that, but I will just focus on this. So what kind of restorative justice is this? The restorative justice envisioned by penal policymaker? Well, it's a restorative justice profoundly defined into criminal justice. Someone said, it was Clifford, diluted, and this is also a case of dilution, you could say, which is the consequence of all this. The consequence is that, as you could see, there is a fundamental gap between those kind of progressive values which restorative justice was kind of born out, or born with, and this idea of restorative justice which kind of underpins or shines through penal policy on RG. The root of this gap, which is kind of unbreachable gap, I believe, is the fact that penal policy kind of understands the social world in a certain way, in a way which is highly individualizing, it is highly simplifying, and it is instrumental to control the social world. And all this is to a large extent incompatible with those values that I mentioned at the beginning. This doesn't mean that penal policy is incompatible with the restorative justice, compatible with the radical core, with those type of progressive values, which I believe are the best values, or the best bits of restorative justice. I could hear some kind of counter objections to the argument, my argument. One is that at the end, penal policy, as bad as it could be, is just a means to an end. And if the end is good, more restorative justice, this kind of good end could retrospectively redeem the means badness. This is a very, I think, dangerous and morally problematic line of thinking, even though quite common, because it's a bit like saying that we do peacemaking through war making, and peacemaking kind of retroactively justifies or kind of redeems war making, something which, by the way, the Western world is very much used to. Very dangerous type of, morally speaking, type of approach. The other type of counter objection to my objection is that at the end, what I'm talking about is just pieces of paper. Policy is just papers. What matters, practitioners, like practitioners who have been talking this afternoon, and I certainly agree. However, if we completely forget about policy, particularly penal policy, we let policymakers off the hook. And I think instead that particularly when they create policy monsters, like I think this ones that I've mentioned earlier on, we should hold policymakers accountable. And at the same time, we shouldn't kind of hand over to practitioners kind of, Promethean task to redeem penal policy, to fix the law on the top of what already they do on a daily basis. There's not much surprise about what I'm saying, because at the end of the day, this radical core, this very progressive values, have always been, I think, minor component, one of the streams constituting restorative justice. The problem is that today are minor than ever. And this is a problem because I think that the potential of restorative justice to be something better than criminal justice, and not just a better criminal justice, lies with those values, with that radical core. So what to do? I don't know. I guess what not to do, probably. I could say something about it. Well, one thing is, at least subject to critical scrutiny, the idea that policy is destiny. If we want to do restorative justice, we need policy. We need to lobby for policy, particularly penal policy. Penal policy is not neutral. It's actually loaded of values, and those values are incompatible with those radical values of restorative justice. And the other thing is that all this is completely pointless if we separate, like criminal justice does, and I think it kind of echoes, I think, Gary's points, if we separate restorative justice from social equality. If we think that restorative justice is about people sitting across the same table with individual stories, but without a social history, which is the mistake systemically kind of performed by criminal justice. If we do this also with restorative justice, we can end up reproducing the same type of systemic issues, but without the expertise of the criminal justice world. So it would be even worse. And we know that this is a challenge for restorative justice ahead. So a few questions also for those who do not share my kind of normative commitment for those values that I have mentioned.
Okay, you've got 1 minute.
This is the last slide. Last slide. Thank you, Kevin. Last slide. So, okay. What is success for restorative justice? What does it mean, success for the restorative justice movement? Which is the toll to pay when we ask for more policy on restorative justice? And is community the answer? Community could be quite nasty. It's not just a kind of keyword that we can use to fix problems. We should handle with care what we mean by community, and which is the role of practitioners in dealing with this kind of problematic, morally, penal policy on restorative justice. These are just questions for those who do not share my commitment with values. I think they're still valid. And nothing fail like success, something Nils Christie used to say also. It's not pessimistic. It's about critical. It's about being critical with restorative justice. And I think this is the time, because the restorative justice is growing, that we need to subject restorative justice as friends to critical scrutiny. And instead of popping bottles when we have new penal laws on restorative justice, we should instead be critical and careful about the implications of policy on RG. And that's it. Thank you very much indeed for listening.
Okay, thanks so much for that, Giuseppe. And that was, I think, interesting perspective on RJ and policy. I think we had one question, which I think Gary sort of may have helped to try and answer. And it was a question to you. If you could just, yes, stop sharing the screen, and then we can go back to the thing, if possible. That's all right.
I don't think I'm able to do that. Okay.
Anyway, while you're doing that, let me just. Okay, so I think it was a question from Jane Durston to say, could you expand a bit, please, on criminal justice gatekeepers? I think Gary's sort of had tried to answer that. I think he was talking maybe about the police being the gatekeepers for the criminal justice system, but I wonder if you had a take on that. And unfortunately, I think we just got the one question, and you've only got a minute to answer it, and then I think it's time for a well-earned break.
So the question was about the role of criminal justice gatekeepers. Do you understand correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it is a difficult role, I think, and I guess the basic point is that policy. There is a difference between policy in the books and policy in action. So criminal justice gatekeepers have a critical role in interpreting in a kind of negotiable way policy in order to kind of, to some extent, contrast the tendency of policy, particularly of penal policy, to make restorative justice as just another form of punishment. So progressive criminal justice gatekeepers have a key role in handling policy in a way which kind of fulfills those original values which characterize restorative justice since the origin. The hope for handling restorative justice in a restorative way lies with practitioners and criminal justice gatekeepers. So that's a critical role. And the other thing is it's about, doing less lobbying for penal laws and looking instead at what type of restorative justice we are creating. This is what I think.
Okay, great. Many thanks for that, Giuseppe, and many thanks for the input. And also, I realised you weren't able to make the kind of latter part of today because you had something else on. But thanks for coming in early to do this this session. So, folks, just a very quick thing, housekeeping thing before we kind of go to a break. And I'm hopeful that everyone who's speaking this afternoon, I've kind of somehow managed to make you all a co-host. So if not, let me know. So we're due to start back again at 3 o'clock, where we'll get some more presentations, I think, from people who've written for the BJCJ. So I think we've all kind of earned a break and maybe a cup of coffee or something like that. So obviously we'll see you back here in just over 10 minutes. And I guess in the meantime, I'm sure you'll do this anyway, but you might want to just put your microphones off and also to stop your video in the meantime. Okay, so see you shortly, folks. Of our seminar today, and this is the bit where we're kind of getting some presentations from authors who've written papers for the Restorative Justice Special Issue published by the British Journal of Community Justice. Just for anyone who might have joined in the meantime, just to let you know that we're recording the session. You can see a little red light in the sort of top left-hand corner. So in this session, the way we kind of going to run it is that for at least a couple of parts of the session, we're sort of pairing up speakers. So we've got to begin with some input from Charlotte Culkin, and then directly after her from Francois Lou, and 10 minutes each, roughly, folks, and then we'll have around about 10 minutes for questions, and then after that we'll move on to the next sort of kind of section where unfortunately we were hoping that Dave Nicholson could join us and to talk about his paper, but unfortunately he can't make it when we found out today. So instead we have, of course, we have Phil Edwards, who's going to talk about his paper, Restorative Justice Without a Victim. 10 minutes from you, Phil, and then 5 minutes for kind of questions or so, and then we'll move on to the last part where we'll be joined at that point, hopefully, by Jennifer Lanterman from the University of Nevada in Reno, and who'll talk for about 10 minutes, and she'll be followed by Rebecca Banwell-Moore, who's a member of the Community Restorative Researchers, reflecting on some of the themes we've talked about today, and then we'll have some kind of Q&A after that as well. Okay. Right, so if everyone's okay, perhaps we can kind of start with the first two presentations in that sequence then. So very warm welcome, Charlotte. Thanks for joining us, and also thanks for writing for the journal.
You're welcome.
It's great to have input. So over to you first.
Can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Great, good. Oh, it is so lovely. Can I just say first off, to see so many faces that I know from the restorative world, Paul and Gavin and Tim and Gary, and it's a real pleasure. And I have to say, I'm a bit nervous, and the reason why I'm a bit nervous is because I'm really a practitioner. And so this is the first time for me talking about a paper. And this paper is based on the paper I wrote for my master's in applied criminology on restorative practice in prisons. So, I'm sitting in a prison right now because currently I'm delivering a program in HMP ISIS with Emily over a year, which is very much about what she talked about interventions not being delivered in a vacuum. I promise you I'm going to talk about the paper, not going to talk about the programme, about interventions not being delivered in a vacuum. So we're working on the wing, in the wing with the officers to embed restorative within the whole system of the prison. And it's incredibly interesting year-long piece of work. That's not what I'm here to talk about, but it is why I'm sat here. As I said, I'm a practitioner, a trainer, and our organisation works across all sectors in restorative practice or restorative approaches and restorative justice. And I'm really enjoying seeing this definition being separated in this afternoon and in what Amal was saying at the beginning. So at the beginning of the paper, what I do is I talk a bit about what the difference is between restorative practice and restorative justice, and why that difference matters, and one being a post-harm approach and one being more of a holistic approach to the whole organisation. And really for me, this was taking what's been going on in education and looking to see how it is being applied, or whether it is being applied in prisons. In that, as Gary said, basically I've ripped up everything I was going to say after what was said in the first hour and a half. I just basically went chum, 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 chum. So what Gary was saying about an add-on, right? That's where a lot of restorative justice started in schools. It was an add-on, it was a bolt-on, quite often as an addition to the pastoral care department, where people did a restorative intervention after harm had happened, and it got generally, the restorative justice got lost, subsumed with within the general culture that there was, and it didn't really work. And so Emily's just come back in. So it got lost within the general kind of culture. And what people realized was that in order to embed restorative, it had to become a part of, you know, what I think is like the social lubricant of the whole organization, which is where restorative approaches and restorative practices come in more, and which is what I'm doing in this prison. And I was interested to know whether people knew what that difference was, whether people had any appetite for it, and whether it was going on. So that's what the paper is about. But I want to just go on to something before I go into that, because it's been talked about a lot. Policies, procedures, blah, blah, blah. The work of Johan Galtung. So he says at the top of an organization, you have cultures and values. Right? You have the cultures and values at the top of an organization, and beneath it you have the systems and structures, or the policies and procedures. And beneath that you have the behaviors and the actions of the people who work in that school or in that prison, or who live in it, or that organization or that football club, or wherever you happen to be. Cultures, values, systems, structures, behaviors and actions. And what is the restorative piece is aligning the behaviors and actions to the cultures and the values. That's what our work is. And then the policies and procedures and systems and structures can become fit for purpose because these two are aligned. And that's really what we're doing when we're creating a restorative culture. We're aligning behaviors and actions with cultures and values. And that's why it works so beautifully with rights respecting schools. It acts as the toolkit, the social lubricant for how you create a rights respecting school. And in the same way that we've got the rehabilitation culture in prisons and procedural justice in prisons, the restorative approach and the restorative toolkit is aligned to those ways of working and can give the practical toolkit to support the embedding of a rehab culture and procedural justice. And that's why I think it's such a good fit within prisons, in the same way as it's such a good fit with rights respecting schools. And so you get this, where it's being embedded, you get a similar response. So in schools that have embedded a restorative response, isolation units stop happening. They don't need them. And in the same way, in prisons that are embedding more of a restorative approach, you don't need segs anymore. And there are at least 2 prisons I know of where segs no longer, segregation units no longer exist because they're not needed. Because, in fact, one of them, they just have 1 cell, which they've had to use once in the last 3.5 years. Interesting, right? Interesting. So I set off as a practitioner and put my pracademic hat on and looked at how much is it happening? How much of an appetite is there? Do people know what the difference between restorative practice and restorative justice is? Do people care? And what I found out was, so I've worked, just as a background, I've worked in, I counted the other day, I think it's 48 prisons in the UK over the years that I've been working. But so I've got quite a good kind of general knowledge, but I obviously couldn't work with all of those. So I only focused on 3. And I focused on 3 who I knew were aligning themselves to a restorative culture. My experience is that in the main, most people don't really have a clue about what restorative approaches means. So in this lovely forum, we've got a group of people who are talking about this from such a position of shorthand knowledge. And that is not what it's like out in the real world. So most people didn't know what I was talking about. That could be the way I communicate, which would be a bit sad as it's my field. But what I did discover is that in pockets, there is the most beautiful restorative practice going on. It's not joined up, it's not being harvested, but there are beautiful examples. And I think it was Gary who was talking about grassroots. It's at grassroots where it's happening. And it's where people who have been trained in traditional restorative justice practitioner, offender victim, have realized they've got a tool here that they could apply in different ways. And they've started doing that in prisons to absolutely beautiful effect. So what are the ways in which I saw it playing out? Well, in all 3 prisons, they're using it in adjudications, which is the internal court systems within prisons for those who don't work in prison. So it's when someone does something wrong, they go to an adjudication, and they're using a restorative response. And what it's giving is one of the key principles of restorative. It's giving fair process. And every single resident who I talked to who had been a part of an adjudication, the first thing they said was, it was fair. It was fair. They had a real sense of fairness. I want to go back to something that Gary said. Gary said, crime doesn't just happen by people choosing to be bad. And it just is mirrored beautifully by a quote that I got from a guy who had been a part of a restorative adjudication, who said, by punishing me, you are validating my badness. Well, quote, by punishing me, you are validating my badness. Whereas in an adjudication that was held restoratively, he felt it was a collaborative process. There were consequences to actions, but he felt it was a far more fair process. So it was happening in adjudications. It was also happening in the OMU, where probation, who had been trained in restorative, was seeing how they could use it to support residents on their release by building in restorative conversations with family members and giving them a better toolkit for life after prison. So that was a beautiful way I saw it being used. Another way I saw it being used was one chap I interviewed who had been convicted of homicide when he was about 19 and was just about to go to Cat D, and 2 years previously had got the unenviable reputation of being the person with the most difficult reputation in the prison. And when I met him, he was holding circles, holding restorative circles. He was de-escalating situations on the wing. He had got his Cat D. He was he had restorative running through his DNA, frankly. So it was very interesting to see what happens when you train residents alongside officers and you give residents a voice and you give them the opportunity to be a participant in creating the community in the prison. But as I said, in the main, lots of people, when I mentioned restorative justice or restorative practice or restorative approaches, thought I meant offender victims sat down in a conversation, and there was no point in them learning to train in it because it wasn't ever going to be applicable to them. So I think there's a piece of work that needs to be done about educating people to understand about the benefits of this approach. What are the benefits of this approach? If the aim of what we're trying to do in prisons is encourage people not to do actions again that harm other people, the quote by the resident, "By punishing me, you are validating my badness," responds to that. You know, if what we do is 1 minute,
yeah.
1 minute. 1 minute. You know, if we create a culture where we respond to the impacts of trauma and shame, and we look at using the restorative questions to apply a different lens, we are more likely to get the result that we want. So what did I think? I thought there should be a simple guide for prisons, just like the parole board have just created. There should be a clear definition, a clear explanation, a simple toolkit. And I think officers and residents could be trained in that basic toolkit to give them the skills to have more effective conversations. And I don't think it's a quick fix, but I think it's incredibly necessary. And I've witnessed some really good examples of it working. There you go. Was that a minute?
Yeah, you did very well there, Charlotte. Many thanks. So hopefully with some questions and you can kind of elaborate on some of those themes shortly. Okay, thanks for that. So I'm now going to turn to Francois Lou, who's a senior lecturer at the University of South Africa. So very warm welcome to you, Francois. And I think you're an hour ahead, aren't you? I think, am I right?
Yes, that's correct, Shah. It's now 4:15 in the afternoon here.
Right. Okay. And just to be sure, because when we were putting this program together, and I was just trying to put some information for the promo thing, right? I did come across a South African rugby player that has the same name. You're not moonlighting as a rugby player as well as being a lecturer, are you?
No, I'm the much more handsomer guy.
Ah, okay. clearly. There you go. All right. Okay. Anyway, over to you, Francois.
Thanks, Kevin. Let me just see if I can share my screen, because technology is usually my enemy.
Okay.
I think that is it. Oh,
yep.
There you go. Is it,
we can see it.
Okay,
yeah, we can see it. That's great. Thank you.
All right, no, great stuff. Like Kevin said, my name is Francois Lou, and I'm from the University of South Africa. It's an open distance e-learning institution where I work as a lecturer at the School of Criminal Justice for the last 5 years. Before becoming a lecturer, I was actually a correctional officer for close to 25 years. And I usually refer to myself as a rehabilitated lifer on parole because of all the years that I've been in correctional services. But let me just start off by saying thank you to the British Journal of Community Justice for this opportunity to present a few key points from my paper, Victims' Participatory Rights in Parole Hearings, a South African Perspective. Now, in theory, huge policy and legislative strides have been made in South Africa to promote a victim-centered approach to criminal justice and to empower crime victims to exercise their rights to information and participation in parole hearings. However, practical challenges and obstacles remain for both the Department of South African Department of Correctional Services, and the victims of crime when it comes to implementing the various strategies and policy resolutions for advancing victim participation in the parole process into effect. But before I explain how the rights of victims are enshrined in legislation, it's important to define the term victim first. Now, in South Africa, a victim of crime is defined as any person who directly or indirectly has suffered harm, including physical or mental injury, emotional suffering, economic loss, or substantial impairment of his or her fundamental rights through acts or omissions that are in violation of the criminal law. One should also note that a victim in South Africa is also referred to as a complainant, and pertaining to their involvement in parole board hearings, the rights conferred to either a complainant or victim apply to the relative of a deceased victim as well. Now, in 2004, the South African government developed and approved the Service Charter for Victims of Crime as an important strategy for promoting the rights of victims in the criminal justice process. A range of rights that may be demanded by victims and in the interaction with the criminal justice system and other service providers are identified in the Victims Charter. These include the following. The right to receive information is perhaps the most basic, where crime victims can request to receive notification of parole board proceedings which they may want to attend. The Victims Charter also explains that the right to offer information means the crime victim may participate, if necessary, and where possible, in criminal justice proceedings by attending the bail hearing, the trial, sentencing, and or parole board hearing. Now, criminal justice service providers, for example, prosecutors, the police, and correctional services officials are expected to ensure that any contribution that the crime victim wishes to make to the investigation, prosecution, and parole hearing is heard and considered in these processes. This includes being able to make a written application to the chairperson of the parole board and to attend the parole hearing and submit a written input to the board. Empowering victims to exercise their rights in the parole phase, provision has been made in both subsection 75.4 of the Correctional Services Act 111 of 1998 and section 299A of the Criminal Procedure Act 51 of 1977, which was amended by our Judicial Matters Second Amendment Act 55 of 2003. Now, subsection 75.4 of the Correctional Services Act stipulates the following regarding a complainant or relative being allowed to make representations when parole placement is to be considered. In terms of section 299A of the Criminal Procedure Act, it provides for the right of a complainant or an immediate relative of the deceased in case of a murder to make a representation relating to the placement of a sentence on federal on parole. This provision focuses only on serious offences, for example, murder, rape, robbery, sexual assault, and kidnapping. Now, it stipulates that the complainant or relative must inform the Commissioner of Correctional Services in writing of the intention to exercise the right to make representations or attend a parole board meeting. It also further states that the Commissioner of Correctional Services shall inform the parole board in question accordingly, and that the parole board shall inform the complainant or relative in writing when and to whom he or she may make representations, or when and where a meeting will take place. Now, in 2005, specific directives to facilitate and promote the involvement of complainants in parole board hearings were issued by the Commissioner of Correctional Services in terms of the Section 299A of the Criminal Procedure Act. Now, these directives sets out the manner and circumstances in which a complainant or relative may exercise their rights to attend a parole board meeting or make representations. It aims to provide members of the parole boards and complainants with information and guidelines on amongst others, how a complainant can request to be involved in a parole board meeting, the format and content of representations, what influence representations will have on the decision of the parole board. Now, coming to the challenges and obstacles to victim participation. Now, the main obstacle to victim participation in parole hearings is that victims' rights, as contained in the Victims' Charter, as I mentioned before, and relevant legislation, are not considered before making parole decisions. Now, the rights of victims to receive and offer information and to make submissions against the granting of parole, for example, how the crime has affected their lives, are not always recognized. Even our own Minister of Justice and Correctional Services even admitted publicly that victims of heinous crimes are not always informed when offenders are considered for parole. Now, secondly, the stance of the South African Department of Correctional Services is that all parole considerations should include victim participation. Yet, tracing the victims of crime and preparing them to participate in parole board hearings and restorative justice programs has been a major challenge for the department. It's likely that most victims are unaware of their participatory rights in parole hearings, and even where victims can be traced, some are reluctant or unwilling to make submissions to the parole board or even participate in the restorative justice processes. This might be out of fear that the offender will reoffend, or the victim has not fully recovered psychologically, physically, or even financially from the incident. Thirdly, the fact is that victims seldom receive any counseling before or after a parole board hearing. Personally, I do not know of a single case where a victim has received counseling in preparation for a parole board hearing. For me, raises a huge red flag. We simply cannot allow victims to feel that they are being victimized by the criminal justice system. And then lastly, in South Africa, little or no research exists regarding victim participation in the parole decision-making process, and reliable statistical information is, so to speak, hidden from public view. I think there are still too many unanswered questions. And it's also still unknown, for example, what consequences victim participation in parole decisions or in restorative justice programs may hold for victims and offenders, as well as what influence victim participation has in parole board decisions at the parole release hearing. So concluding, definitely in South Africa, much more needs to be done to ensure that victims' participatory rights in parole hearings are adequately supported. In the parole process, the best case scenario, according to Oliver, would be for victims to first participate in restorative justice programs, for example, the victim-offender dialogue, victim-offender mediation programs, and later making an input at the parole board hearing. Restorative justice programs could then inform the parole decision and lead to decisions that are fair for both the victim and the offender. Now, fundamentally, most victims seem to want offenders to be accountable for their actions and the harm done to them. And ultimately, they want to find closure and move on with their lives. So the challenge for parole boards in making parole decisions is to find the balance between offender rehabilitation and the restorative justice ideals of healing and restoration. I thank you, Kevin, and I think I've practiced this a lot, and I think it's definitely within 10 minutes.
Yeah, you've done very well there, Francois. I was just about to sort of press the thing and say, you 2 minutes, but you've done fantastically well. So many thanks for that, Francois. So I just wonder whether we have some questions for both Charlotte and Francois, and I can see there's a question for Charlotte here from Anton. So for Charlotte, when you were implementing these restorative practices in the prison environment, did you find there was a filter effect to the other inmates?
Well, is it contagious? is that what the question is?
I think what it means is, by that I mean, did it actually begin to change the politic of the prison itself?
Oh yeah, definitely. Oh, definitely. And one of the things I failed to say actually is, whilst in the main a lot of people didn't understand the nuance between restorative approaches and restorative justice, the senior leadership teams, there's a big appetite for it, because they are, you know, they know command and control isn't working. They know that overstroking isn't working, and they're really looking for a third way, a way of, you know, high expectation and high support. So there is definitely an appetite for it, and they just don't know how to embed it. So, and to answer the question, when it starts getting embedded in pockets, does it have a ripple effect? Yes, it does, categorically. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks so much for that. So I think we've got another question for Charlotte, but I'm just going to go to Francois first, actually, because I think you mentioned about the barriers there were, I think, in relation to kind of victims engaging. And I just wondered, did you have any thoughts on how some of those barriers could be addressed, actually? And I think you kind of alluded to them in your, well, not alluded to, you did sort of mention some things, I think, in your paper about how this could be addressed, Francois.
Yes, Kevin, definitely. Look, most of the victims come from very, very poor social economic circumstances. So I think South Africa should definitely, first of all, develop a funding model for the reimbursement of travel expenses first of all. And then I think they also should provide on-site counseling services to victims before and after a parole board hearing, because like I said in my presentation, for me that is a huge red flag. I can just quickly mention as well with regards to that, just a couple of weeks ago I attended a victim offender dialogue session from one of our non-government organization. We listened to victims of crime, mostly rape victims, and the one lady giving a testimony, and the words stuck with me, is that she feels like that she has been raped by the criminal justice system. So that, for me, to hear things like that, that is really terrible. So counseling for victims is definitely a must. And then and with tracing of victims as well, I think we definitely need a victim database to make sure that the victim's information is available, so that the tracing perhaps could be much easier. And then, yeah, just to promote awareness campaigns on victims' rights and restorative justice programs.
Great. Okay. Thanks a lot, Francois. So back to you, Charlotte. So it's a question from Nina at the CHA. How do you think we can best educate, inform, and inspire people in prison, on probation, staff and families about restorative practices and approaches? E.g., I know you've done some films. Is that one way?
Yeah. Really interesting question. I mean, for example, the project that we're doing in ISIS, we have done a piece for Inside Times, the prison newspaper.
Okay. Yeah.
So we did a piece that was published in February for that. We've got, this is for family members, really simple. So every family member who's, well, every resident's participating in it. So every family member gets the opportunity to get one of these. One of the ways that Giuseppe was talking about things like drift. And one of the ways that we prevent drift on the program is by making films so that it holds its integrity. Right. And actually we made films for the officers to understand while they were queuing for their COVID tests, so they could sit and listen to people talking about what the program's about. We got men with lived experience to talk about why they thought it was a good idea getting involved. So yes, films are a good way, very simple comms that are very relatable, and messaging everywhere.
Okay, great. So a very quick follow-up question to you, Charlotte, and I've got another question for Francois here. Is there already a toolkit available for probation and residents in prison to learn and practice restorative approaches?
I think there are lots of people who are developing toolkits, and we've certainly got one. And I think there are other organizations who are on this call or in this session who have also developed. I think, yeah, and it's really simple, the toolkit. We just need to get the backing of HMPPS to get it out there. And what I would really love, I was talking to Emily about this, is that, you know, if prison officers are going to be trained in control and restraint and CNR for a week, let's give them an equal amount of time to learn relational skills training.
Okay, thanks for that. And thanks to Emily Cutty for that question. So I'm going to go to another question for Francois. This comes from Rebecca. Francois, in your paper, you state that victims are now attending RJ programs before the parole hearing. And does this impact on victim participation in the actual parole hearing? And are the RJ programs widely offered prior to parole hearings? That's a couple of questions there. Roll them together.
Yes, thanks, Rebecca, for your question. Yes, definitely. As one of the programs that are being offered is a restorative justice orientation program. It's a correctional program where offenders, before being considered for parole, should attend this program. In a nutshell, it just basically explains the restorative justice, what the impact it has, and hopefully from this program that offenders will feel like they need to really connect with the victims and explain or just to connect with the victims. We very much rely, or the Department of Correctional Services very much rely on non-government organizations as well as faith-based organizations to come and present the victim-offender dialogue and the victim-offender mediation and so on, and to offenders. I know recently the parole boards actually made this now compulsory for offenders before being placed on parole to attend one of these programs before being considered. But it's not the main factor. Resources are very scarce, so it's a very, very difficult process. And I think you also asked, does this have an impact on victim participation? Yeah, I wish I knew the answer for that. It's like I stated in my presentation, there's very, very limited research. So there's a huge gap in South Africa with regards to conducting research on victim participation, the impact it has on parole decisions and so on.
Okay, that's great. So just a very quick question, I think, for you, Francois. This is from Martin. And the question is, we all kind of, when we work in criminal justice, and we love acronyms, don't we? So did SATRC impact the RJ movement in South Africa?
Yes, you're referring, Martin, I think you're referring to the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Yes, I think it did open up some room for the restorative justice system, because especially of this commission, it also dealt with forgiveness and healing. And I think definitely, I don't have 100% the correct answer, but personally, I think it definitely had an impact on the restorative justice movement in some way in South Africa.
Okay, Francois, thanks for that. And then I think final question for this session for you, Charlotte. So,
Yeah.
Will the restorative approaches used with prisoners also used with staff when dealing with disciplinary issues?
Yes. And actually, Emily and I were just having a conversation about that. Yes, in the prisons that were adopting a restorative approach, yes. However, I do think that there's a much more outward facing towards the residents, as opposed to how can we embed this and model it ourselves amongst ourselves. That needs to be done much more.
Great. Okay. Thanks so much for that, and thanks for Angelina Murphy for that question. So again, just a quick thing. We can get these slides off Francois, and we'll sort of share those as well after today. But I'm just going to move on now to our next speaker, Phil Edwards. Phil, you're there. I think I can see you ready and poised to go. So very warm welcome to you, Phil, from, I was going to say, I don't know, is it sunny Manchester?
Reasonably.
reasonably sunny Manchester. Okay, that's probably as good as it gets. Okay, over to you, Phil.
Okay. So my paper was called Restorative Justice Without a Victim, Rise and the Roads Not Taken. It was originally going to be called The Trouble with Uncle Harry, because it began with a curiosity that I had about this figure of Uncle Harry, who was it was John Braithwaite talked a lot about Uncle Harry in some papers he wrote around about the turn of the century, and it was talking about the use of community-based RJ to deal with victimless crime, specifically things like drink drive, well, very specifically drink driving. And he suggested that one outcome of a restorative session could be the mobilisation of the entire community to prevent reoffending. So, you know, as part of the conference agreement, the drink driver's friends would agree, someone would agree to be his designated driver, you know, the barman of the local pub would agree not to serve him when he was drunk, and his Uncle Harry might step in and agree to confiscate his car keys every Friday so that he couldn't go out on the lash. And Braithwaite then goes on to say, and you know, in the case of reoffending, this could be escalated, and the conference could agree that Uncle Harry, in those cases, Uncle Harry had confiscate the car for a year initially, you know. And this intrigued me, you know, just because I'm as an academic, I'm, you know, very interested in punishment and penology, and you know, I was looking at this and thinking, well, where's the contestability? You know, where's the comparability? Where's the you know, just desserts in this? You know, it just seems to be completely uncontrolled. Albeit community-based coercion being applied to this drink driver, and so when I was thinking about, you know, what I might like to investigate this in the terms of RJ, this kind of came back to mind. And what I found was that I was interested to see where this idea came from, and also whether it had ever really been successfully implemented. And what I found was that it went back to the rise. Reintegrative shaming experiments that were carried out in Canberra, that were in the late 90s, in and around Canberra, and a team led by Larry Sherman and Heather Strang. And the big set of randomized controlled trials of a variety of different types of crime, 3 types of crime involving a victim, and a trial of drink driving. And the team kind of speculated that in the drink driving trial, although there wouldn't be any kind of confrontation between the offender and the victim, nevertheless they might get good, you know, anti-criminogenic results by one of 2 mechanisms, either by this kind of community-based mobilization or by kind of victimless variant of shaming. So, you know, instead of being coming face to face with a victim, the offender would effectively be shamed by the community collectively. And this was, you know, quite speculative. Then they carried out the trial. They you know, 450 drink drivers went through restorative sessions, and another 450 went to court. And eventually the results came in, and the results were terrible. The other three trials, the ones involving crimes with a victim, predatory crimes, all had brilliant results, and that led to a whole lot more trials that Joanna Shapland and her team wrote up in later years. But the drink driving trial was completely unsuccessful. Reoffending increased. It was actually worse than court, and this intrigued me. And what intrigued me even more was that digging into the sort of grey literature, the project reports and things, it seemed there was some evidence that the kinds of mechanism that the team had suggested might work had actually been there. There was some evidence and sort of attempts to, evoke stronger community ties. There was some evidence of attempts to induce shame. There was a lot of evidence, actually, of attempts to induce shame, particularly by the sort of community representative who was invited to sit in on these conferences. And yet this victimless shaming and this sort of community-based coercion, neither of these things actually seem to have happened. And what seemed gone on, and this is all based on, as I say, grey literature, the stuff that's publicly available, where these results have been analysed and reanalysed by other people. So it's all very, very secondary on my part. But what seems to have gone on is that the conferences, on the shaming front in particular, the conferences didn't succeed in inducing the right kind of shame. And this is particularly important because if you don't induce the right kind of shame, you're liable to induce the wrong kind of shame. What I mean by this is that in a lot of cases, the offender effectively got stuck in a state of what Nathan Harris called unresolved shame. And an unresolved shame is that state when you know that somebody thinks you should be ashamed of something you've done, but you don't quite buy it yourself, but you can't quite dismiss it, but you don't quite believe it, but you don't quite, so people get stuck in this sort of oscillation between feeling the shame being, imposed on them and wanting to reject it, but you're not being able to. And, that's quite a psychologically unhealthy state to be in. And it's a state that's conducive to reduced reoffending. And the reason for this seemed to be two things. Firstly, that to induce the right kind of shame, to induce shame that people could actually sort of engage with and work through, it looked as if they needed two things. One was value consensus. The offender needed to go into the room already sharing the values in the name of which the conference is going to be speaking to them. And secondly, mutual respect needed to be, again, pre-existing mutual respect between the offender and the participants. And in the absence of value consensus, in the absence of mutual respect, you don't get a decent level of, the right kind of shaming. Having got this far, I showed the draft to someone else who said, that's all very interesting, but have you considered that there are, X in number of highly successful initiatives in RJ which don't necessarily involve victim, and gave me this long list, which I discuss in the last section of the paper. And because the tendency of the paper was really to suggest that if you are processing an offender through RJ, to put it in its most schematic terms, if you've got an offender and you want to go down the RJ route, you really need to confront that offender with a victim. The chances of having value consensus and mutual respect if the victim isn't there are very, very low. So having a certain amount of evidence of restorative panels, neighbourhood justice panels, and so on, which didn't always involve a victim, seem to be you know, counter evidence, and I kind of deal with that in, as I say, in the last section of the paper. You know, I won't go into it in great detail now, just except to say that you know, my basic position is unchanged. I think it's in conclusion, really, I think it's very telling that you know, certain types of restorative process, you know, which is sort of extended beyond the victim-offender encounter, aren't as effective. And I think that, you know, there is a slight danger of sort of pointing at things and calling them restorative, of saying that you know, you know, this is a restorative panel because we want it to be a restorative panel, without actually the prerequisites for that. That's not to say that you know, victims always need to be involved. There will always be cases where it's not possible, I guess, to either to identify a direct victim, or cases where the direct victim doesn't actually want to be involved. But I think, you know, we need to kind of face that head on and realise that, you know, if we want to go down the restorative route in the absence of a victim, then you know, the bar that much higher. There needs to be there needs to be, you know, much greater level of consensus, and I guess much greater level of preparation than would be the case if the victim was on hand.
Okay, Phil, I think your time's up, as it were.
Oh, great.
Okay, but
I don't know how I'm for time, but that's about
no,
it.
no, okay, okay. So there's a question for you, recently here, I think, from Martin, or question come kind of comment. Okay, so in the chat, and so Martin saying the Uncle Harry process, questionable RJ process, in my opinion, an offender having to be specific amount of family members to the meeting, who of his family members who might show up the offence. They may have confirmed the less serious nature of the offence. Culture may have played a part in this. Other type of crimes, the conference may be more appropriate about victim present or surrogate victim. Any kind of quick responses back to that? I think it's just trying to explore that a bit more, where you were talking before about that issue. Yeah,
I think it is. It's an interesting feature of the right trials, which I didn't mention, but it's in the paper that the drink driving offenders had to bring a certain number of supporters to the conference. I think they had to bring at least 5 people, and you know, they were very strict about this. If you didn't have your 5 supporters, then you'd be rescheduled, and that had some surprising effects in practice, because in practice you didn't get the family doing the Uncle Harry act and saying, you know, we'll take care of him. In practice, mostly you have friends and relatives saying, you know, what's the problem here? So he has a drink, actually, you know. So it did kind of backfire that. And the point about surrogate victims is really interesting as well, because you know, there have been cases. Or you know, there have been approaches to RJ which seem to run quite successfully, having as you say, a surrogate victim, like you know, a representative shopkeeper in the case of shoplifting and so on. I think, you know, what the research seems to say is that can work, but the you know, emotional engagement and the emotional impact is that much lower. I think, you know, there's just something very powerful about the victim saying, this is what you did to me, and wherever it goes after that. And you know, you kind of miss that if you've got a surrogate saying, this is the kind of thing that people like you may have done to people like me.
Okay, so just before we finish on this session, Phil, so just to make it clear, because people may not be familiar, so the particular project you were talking about, that took place in Australia, right?
Mm-hmm,
Australia? Yeah. So it's Australia, and that's where that particular scheme kind of took place. And it was a while ago, wasn't it? I think, right? It was. I think you were saying.
Yeah, as I say, late 90s, and in the
late
early
90s.
in the early
Okay.
noughties, there was
Okay.
a Home Office funded series of trials that kind of followed on from that.
Right.
But I don't think anyone's ever really done RJ for drink as such for drink driving since. So maybe it's that people
Okay.
the failures being people kind of learnt from practice, even though it hasn't really been written about much.
Okay. Very last question to you from Domina, who's asking. In that instance, was the victim able to write a victim impact statement?
Yeah. Yeah, not that I'm aware. I mean, it will vary a lot between different jurisdictions.
Okay.
I was interested from Peter there. We in Wales probation do RJ for drink driving.
Right. Okay.
Yeah,
I'm just kind of, yeah, and also I think Peter's saying use for the police and fire service to talk to. Okay, I'm just thinking, I'm conscious of the time, Phil. So thanks so much for your input. I mean, maybe you could reply back to Peter or whoever else on the chat if you could, or in fact, if you put your email address, they can always contact you afterwards, right? And also, I would say that if anyone's got any questions for any of the speakers that we're not able to cover, then maybe please just put it in the chat and maybe ask the speakers and maybe kind of give your email address, something like that. Okay, so to the last two speakers, we're going to kind of present sort of back to back. So we've got Jennifer coming up, and then we'll have Rebecca to kind of maybe draw on some of the key themes that have come out of some of the research, and also maybe the talks and presentations earlier on today. And then we'll have some kind of questions for both Jennifer and Rebecca together. But first, over to Jennifer, and a very warm welcome. I don't know what the weather's like in Reno, Nevada, but hopefully it's kind of pleasant enough for you, and it's not too early in the morning, I think, I gather there, right?
It's just before 8 a.m., so
Okay.
not too bad, not too bad. And this week we've had 3 seasons, so who knows what we're going to get today.
Okay,
All right.
that's great. Anyway, welcome to the seminar anyway. Very good to have you here.
Thank you. All right, so I'm going to share some slides just to anchor some of my comments this morning. Okay, move this down. Okay, so I hope you are able to see our title slide here. So good West Coast morning. My name is Jennifer Lanterman. I am a professor at the Department of Criminal Justice at the University of Nevada, Reno. I am a researcher, and I'm also a restorative conference facilitator. So I've got both research and practical sort of interest in restorative justice. And I am pleased to share with you today an article that was published in the British Journal of Community Justice titled Models versus Mechanisms: The Need to Crack the Black Box of Restorative Justice. So the central issue explored in the article is that the research tells us that restorative justice can produce desirable outcomes and sometimes counterproductive outcomes, but it does not tell us why or how. So there's a good deal of literature on restorative justice, which focuses on 4 primary areas. The literature abounds with discussions about how to define or conceive of restorative justice, as well as the restorative philosophy itself. The literature also includes the explication of theoretical models of practice. This literature describes both models that include what are generally considered the 5 key components of restorative justice, and models that do not include all 5 key components. So an example of that would be models that don't involve the victim of the particular incident being discussed. There is a literature reporting on the outcome evaluations of models of practice. So the really critical issue here is that this literature reports on the effects of respective models in their entirety, but does not report on the relative effectiveness of the key components of the model, right? So we basically have, if you want to use a medical metaphor, we have a pill, and we have a medication, and it has a bunch of ingredients in it, but we don't know which ingredient or ingredients are the active ingredient or ingredients in restorative justice. And finally, there is considerably smaller literature on facilitator training and program certification criteria. In the United States, there are no uniform criteria for programs or practice, unlike some other countries. And this is likely attributable to the absence of established evidence-based practices due to the absence of research exploring the components of restorative justice. So there is insufficient research examining the mechanisms of restorative justice that produce the positive or negative counterproductive outcomes. There are three areas that really require some systematic evaluation. So generally the aim in restorative justice is to maximize voluntary participation by victims and offenders while minimizing coercion. There's much discussion about the importance of voluntariness, the presence of coercion or lack thereof, and the effect or the desirability of coercion, particularly with respect to offender participation. However, there is scant research on the role of voluntariness in restorative justice. And please forgive me if I mispronounce this last name, Basalnir and Sivasubramaniam found that coercion resulted in offenders expressing less remorse or guilt and the decreased potential for resolution. But there is little else in the study of this key theoretical component of restorative justice. And so we need to understand the role or the importance of voluntariness relative to coercion. But there are some concerns about the risk of randomly assigning victims to face-to-face encounters with offenders and the potential for traumatizing or re-victimizing victims. So researchers may consider designing studies that explore the effect of voluntary participation versus coerced participation on the part of offenders. Most scholarship implies, but does not explicitly state, that restorative practices ought to occur in person. Zare explains that face-to-face interactions are an ideal form for restorative justice, but they are not required. And a majority of the scholarship describing models of practice and program evaluations focus on programs that support in-person meetings between victims and offenders. But there is inadequate research on the effect of these in-person meetings on outcomes. And at the time of writing of this article, I was not able to locate any published studies that compare victim and offender participation in person and through the use of video conference technology, for example, so other types of technological support of victim-offender contact. So given the changes that we observed with COVID, the likely emergence of future pandemics, and the potential for expanding efficacious restorative practices, practitioners and researchers would be well advised to explore the effectiveness of virtual restorative conferences or other types of restorative practices. And the evaluations reported on in the literature focus on whether or not a particular outcome was achieved through a restorative practice. So something like victim perceptions of safety or reduced offender recidivism. However, there is very little research on what about the models, the mechanisms in those models, whether that is a victim offender conference, victim offender dialogue, a family group conference. So whatever model we're using, the literature is reporting on whether or not the model in its entirety produced some particular outcome, instead of what component of that model produced the outcome under observation that we're exploring or interested in. So researchers need to isolate and manipulate key components of restorative justice encounters to determine which components are critical, which components are unnecessary. So like they're present, but they have no effect on what's going on. And with which components there may be flexibility. So that might help us figure out in which situations maybe we can sort of remove a component without diluting positive effects or generating negative effects. So currently the evidence base of restorative justice is the results of evaluation research of theoretical models, right? But those theoretical models require systematic evaluation, right? So we need to explore the circumstances in which these models are implemented, the components of those models individually, so the importance of them individually, and the interaction effects between those components. And this could generate a sufficient body of research that will allow us to establish a set of evidence-based restorative justice practices, which we currently do not have. There's no agreed upon evidence-based set of restorative justice practices to date. Once a set of evidence-based restorative justice practices has been established, then those evidence-based practices can be used to develop or inform changes to facilitator training. What that can do then potentially is, once we understand what works and what does not work and why, and we modify our training for conference facilitators, that might help us work through some of the lack of consensus in the outcome literature, because there's some outcome literature that indicates that whatever the restorative practice being under study is in that particular study produces a desirable outcome. In other research, there's an indication that the model being employed in that study produces a counterproductive outcome. And we don't see reported in published literature research about situations in which restorative justice did not appear to produce any outcome at all that would be different than a standard criminal case process, right? So I think we have a problem here that is a combination of not having an established set of evidence-based practices, and also a more general publication issue where it can be difficult to get certain types of results published, right? So research that reports no results is often difficult to get published. So once we can actually establish this body of literature or this body of evidence-based practices, and we modify facilitator training, then what that might result in is a shift in what we're observing in outcome evaluations, right? So if we can better match, we figure out what in the programs and the practices needs to be there and maybe what can be removed, and we figure out how to better match restorative practices with people who are likely to benefit from them, we may then be able to recommend changes to practices and programs as necessary. And those recommended changes can result in program design that will enhance the positive outcomes of restorative practices while reducing the negative or counterproductive outcomes of some restorative encounters. Great. Thank you.
Okay, many thanks for that, Jennifer. And I think we'll obviously come back to you with some kind of questions once we've heard from Rebecca. So I think if you could, which you're probably all doing, if you could stop share, then we can come back to the main thing.
Whoops. There we go.
That's great. Thank you. Okay. Thanks so much for that, Jennifer. So we'll kind of come back to that, I think, in a moment. So Rebecca, sorry, I was looking around for you there. Spotted you. Okay, look, welcome, Rebecca. Many thanks for agreeing to do this kind of last bit, which is to sort of very helpfully, I think, perhaps to draw together some of the threads from the discussions and some of the research that we've heard about today.
Yeah.
So over to yourself, and yeah, there you go.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Kevin, for the graveyard shift. So still a lot of us here, so that's good. So what I just wanted to do was to kind of spend the next 10 minutes given a brief overview of the presentations and what themes have emerged from these studies, and then give an overview of what other research is currently being conducted to give sort of a real understanding of what areas of RJ are being focused on and next steps. So for those of you that don't know me, I'm Dr. Rebecca Banwell-Moore. I'm a research fellow at the University of Nottingham, but today I'm representing the community of restorative researchers. You can find us on Facebook, and yeah, we've got a really good team internationally of restorative researchers, so it really enables us to you know, exchange knowledge and ideas. So anyway, let's go. Hold on. Just going to try and work out why I can't. That's it. Okay, we're getting there. Me and technology. Okay, so just going to give you a quick overview of today's research presentations and what I've taken from those presentations. So thanks to all of you for presenting. I think it's a really interesting papers there. Firstly, Giuseppe sort of outlined this issue of the institutionalization of restorative justice into the criminal justice system and how it sterilizes the potential of restorative justice to actually be something different and better, how it reshapes both the rationales and the functioning of restorative justice. Because the promises of RJ of kind of deprofessionalization, the critique of punishment, direct stakeholder centrality, and that kind of cooperative and transformative approach to dealing with social conflicts and harm, which, you know, which as Giuseppe kind of says, constitute the radical core of restorative justice, potentially are obliterated when it gets shoehorned into the criminal justice system. And Charlotte then went on to discuss how she found that when restorative practice was implemented well in prisons, that there were a number of key benefits to both staff and prisoners in terms of actually implementing restorative practice. So staff prisoner well-being improved, quality of life for both improved, perceptions of procedural fairness improved, and it sort of enabled this culture of fairness to emerge. And the restorative practice processes could be used to diffuse confrontation and conflict. However, very few of the staff were actually trained, and the issue here is that restorative practice doesn't sit at the heart of the prison philosophy. So it's being used on an ad hoc basis and at the discretion of those that are actually trained or capable of employing restorative practices. But each prison actually introduced restorative practices to its culture with varying degrees of success. And Charlotte kind of touched on the need for a toolkit to actually really embed restorative practice in the prison system. Francois then gave us an overview of how victims in South Africa now have the legal right to make representations at parole board hearings. So all parole hearings should include victim participation. But he touched on the fact that there's still a number of practical challenges that remain. So despite the legislation and policy, the structure is an issue. There's no structure to actually keep victims informed of upcoming parole hearings, and the rights of victims to participate are not always recognised by those professionals. And he concluded by suggesting that there were some measures that we could implement to improve victim participation. So maybe the installation of audio-visual systems, and the appointment of specific workers that could actually assist with tracing and contacting victims and helping to prepare them for the RJ programs and the parole board representation. Then we moved on to Phil, and Phil gave us a really good analysis of the reasons why the RISE RJ trial was a failure when it was utilised for drink driving cases. And he argued that when reintegrative shaming is conducted without a victim of crime, then that kind of free deliberation of the community is lost. And an offender's sort of unplanned encounter with shame is supplanted by officially endorsing shaming and the impact that that has. So the restorative conference itself becomes secondary, and rather than it actually being independent, it only serves to kind of the seal of approval to judgments that have already been pre-made by police officers and other professionals. And I think really the key, another point that came out of this paper by Phil was actually the negative results from the RISE drink driving trial was the actual elegant testimony, in his words, to the power and the necessity of the encounter between victims and offenders, and the crucial role played by the victim in defining the moral weight of the offence. And then lastly but not least, we went over to Jennifer, who has joined us early this morning. So Jennifer argued that we need to crack this black box of RJ, that there are still significant gaps in the knowledge in terms of like program development, facilitated training, and the actual implementation of programs, and that these gaps contribute to the varied participant outcomes. So we need to identify the approaches and the mechanisms that produce the most positive or negative outcomes for these participants, and to modify the programs accordingly. So on that note, I direct her to my forthcoming paper on the culture, mechanisms and approaches adopted to deliver RJ. Just get that in there. So those are the papers that were delivered today. So in terms of the actual themes that I kind of picked out of those papers, there are a number of things. So the first one is the risk of institutionalizing RJ. And so how do we embed restorative justice within the criminal justice system and make sure that it still has this deprofessionalisation, that it's independent decision making, and that the main principles of restorative justice of inclusivity and equal access aren't cast aside, that we still have this engagement, the bi-directional dialogue, where professionals aren't, as I allude to, selecting restorative justice ideal victims or participants, where in my research I found that criminal justice professionals are making the decisions on behalf of participants. And where we have this kind of bulk standards, I suppose, as Gary stated, the McDonaldization of RJ, where youth offending teams are using reparation menus, which really do not have any direct reparation back to the victim, and therefore can we really class them as restorative? So that's the first theme. The second theme is this kind of opposing ideologies of restorative justice with criminal justice. How do we shoehorn and mainstream restorative justice into criminal justice processes, when criminal justice processes really are these opposing ideologies of clear victim and offender, based on doing things to people rather than with people, and this view of sort of managerial and mismanagement, which actually hampers and hinders criminal justice professionals from being able to kind of adopt restorative justice approaches, because it doesn't fit with the way that they actually work. Next, there's this theme of one size doesn't fit all, the need to be flexible. So flexibility appeared to be essential to the development of restorative practice in the prisons. Flexibility to use restorative justice at different stages. Restorative justice isn't just there to be offered at the end of the court process, as I found in my research. It's actually, we need to be creative, and we need to be making that offer throughout the criminal justice system. Being flexible to know what's right for this victim and offender. When is it right? Is it face-to-face? Is it remote via video link? Initial talks with facilitators? Because actually, it's not always, the face-to-face is not the creme de creme of restorative justice. For many victims in my research, I found that actually just having a conversation with a restorative justice facilitator was enough. That was empowering for them, and they felt that they'd been involved in the decision-making process. So it's giving them that kind of flexibility and creativity to make sure that we can maximise participation. And the level of awareness and training and funding comes up time and time again. I think pretty much in all of the papers this was touched on. As Charlotte talked about the fact that actually only a few staff were trained, and there's a need for this standardised approach. So we need to be able to be flexible, but also have a standardised approach. Because when we don't have a standardized approach and it just ends up being an add-on, it really is just something that is only used for those who actually know how to use it. So it's something that needs to be funded, and we need to embed a restorative justice or restorative practices, a culture. So that's around in training, incorporating that, and we touched on that today a lot in terms of into initial police training. And I know that there are some police forces, such as Wiltshire, who have been embedding restorative justice training into the initial police training. And implementation of structure and mechanisms. So we need managerial buy-in and support. And the structures and mechanisms used to embed restorative justice into the culture of the criminal justice system. Where it is embedded, then we can see that there are improved perceptions of procedural fairness, and the well-being of the staff and the prisoner relations really improves. And I think that really, that's a key thing, that actually it's not just about the closure and the empowerment and the healing process for victims, but also for offenders as well. And as Jennifer touched on, really about kind of cracking this black box of RJ to understand exactly how do we implement and change the structures and mechanisms needed to make sure that everybody is able to participate in restorative justice. So the culture of restorative justice came through again and again, and I think sort of taking Charlotte's term is RJ doesn't sit at the heart of the prison's philosophy or even the criminal justice system's philosophy. It has to be the social lubricant that runs throughout every single aspect of the criminal justice system. It can't be an add-on. It can't be what I class this optional extra that we just use when criminal justice professionals feel that it might be a good thing to use. It has to be embedded. It has to be the ethos. And when it's just an optional extra, then it's only used and offered when certain professionals or restorative justice champions. I'm just conscious of time, so I want to touch on forthcoming research. But the last thing that's come out of this is around victim participation and the barriers to victim participation. So we need to understand the barriers to victim participation. How is it being offered? How do we trace and contact victims? How do we prepare them? What is the best way of doing this? So just finally, to kind of touch on the other research that's being, just go to that slide, being conducted out in the field at the moment. There's a huge array of RJ research being conducted, so I'm just going to kind of cherry pick a few. So there's quite a lot of research being done on restorative justice and the use in sexual violence and domestic violence, which has always been a bit of a no-no. So that's been explored by Estelle Zingstag at the University of Oxford and Leuven in Belgium, and also Gemma Verona Martinez at the Basque Institute of Criminology in Spain is exploring how restorative justice methods can support victims of domestic violence. And Taligal at the University of Haifa in Israel is researching the use of restorative justice in youth cyber victimization. And Why Me are currently conducting, it's a 3-year project which commenced in October last year, looking at improving restorative practice for young people. So working with youth offending teams to determine how RJ is used, implemented, and how to improve victim participation and participation for BME people in the youth justice system. And research is being done by Mark Walters at the University of Sussex and also Linda Millington for Why Me on the use of RJ in hate crime and hate incidents, and also and how it's being used in universities to deal with those offences. And there's some research being done by Dr. Rhiannon April at UCL and also Belinda Hopkins in using restorative justice in schools. And finally, as you're probably all aware, there's the research that's being done, the Independent Commission into the Experiences of Victims and Long-Term Prisoners, which is being headed up by Bishop James Johns of Liverpool. And I know that he has been looking at the use of restorative justice in prisons there. And restorative policing, we've got Dr. Kerry Clamp at the University of Nottingham is working with professors at the University of Beijing on RJ and policing practice in diverse contexts. And furthermore, Professor Joanna Shackland and Alan Crawford, their team have conducted an 18-month study looking at assisting the police in identifying means for frontline officers to actually facilitate restorative policing. And Ian Marder, who's now over in Dublin, is producing a RJ service map and case studies of restorative justice in the Irish criminal justice system. And as I say, I have a forthcoming paper on the culture, mechanisms and approaches adopted by criminal justice agencies delivering restorative justice. And currently working on another forthcoming paper on prisoner participation in the complaints process and how restorative justice can actually facilitate that and give victims voice, prisoners voice, and allow them to engage in systemic change. So I think one last bit, that is it.
Okay.
So the research really is focused, the research focus has moved away from does it work, can it work, and who does it work for, but how is it actually being applied practically, and how can we embed RJ into a culture, a criminal justice system?
Great. Okay. Thanks so much for that, Brooke. Sorry to cut you off there, but you've
no problem.
Okay. Thanks very much for that. Thanks to Jennifer. So I think we've got time for probably a question each to each of you, I think, before we kind of finish. So I'm going to go back to a question that I think was asked a couple of times, and I don't think anyone's caught. I didn't pick it up earlier on, and maybe this is something that you may be able to help answer, actually, Rebecca. So we've got a question from Patrick Hennigan-Keane, and I wonder if there's any research on this, which is how do we educate and engage with the legal community, right, in particular prosecutors, on restorative values, practice and outcomes, so that they will consider RJ as a viable justice option earlier on in the criminal justice process, which in fact, I don't think we've quite touched on the legal community in relation to RJ. Any thoughts on that, Rebecca?
I think the difficulty, as you say, is actually, because I think that is a real barrier as well, because we can train police and we can train facilitators and yacht and probation.
Yeah.
And we know that actually you can defer sentencing for an RJ process to take place. However, that really isn't happening. So I think that we do need to kind of now start to push into that field to really start to work with prosecutors and judges and magistrates so that they can understand the benefits of restorative justice. Great.
Okay. Thanks, Rebecca. And I guess the thing is that if people have got any other kind of answers for the question, that particular question, then feel free to put them on the chat. Or, in fact, if let's see, if Patrick, you could put your email address in there, then maybe if people got any kind of answers or thoughts, they can maybe email you after the event today, because we'll share the chat with everybody afterwards. So, one final question to Jennifer, and I'm just going to find it now because I had it a moment ago. And I think it was a question from Gavin in relation to, comment or question from Gavin in relation to, I think, that's it. In terms of opening the black box, to what extent might the offender background psychology, victim background psychology, and the relationships make a difference to probability of positive outcomes? So, e.g., could there be a type of person where RJ of one kind works for their offending and RJ of another kind works for someone else?
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely think so, because a restorative encounter is a dynamic social situation, right? So we think of any other dynamic social situation, how people behave in those situations and those encounters and how they walk away from them, the impact of those situations is at least in part a function of who they are and everything that has happened in their lives in right up to that moment, right? So
right.
That's why you can have two people who experience the same type of crime, but walk away from that crime with very different experiences. Like that harm is exerting a different impact in their lives. Sometimes you have victims who sort of want to figure out what's going on, and sometimes, quite honestly, you have people who are committed to being victims.
Okay.
You know, they want to stay that way. They want to lecture. They want to chastise. They don't want to figure out why it happened and what the solution is. They're sort of they want to stay in place instead of figure out how to move forward. You have offenders who are very focused on what is happening to me. The accountability is what happens to me. It's the legal process. It's not about the victim, right? So I'm absolutely convinced that individual characteristics, traits, experiences of both victims and offenders, when they interact with each other in those restorative encounters, might really produce varied outcomes, which is why I think that sort of there's one study produced by Sherman and colleagues that indicated that there were, for some offenders, a restorative encounter was actually counterproductive. It increased the likelihood they would reoffend. I have not seen those results replicated anywhere, but it's a big question for me. Why did that happen? What was it about that group of offenders that resulted in that type of outcome, which is exactly what we don't want to do, right? So there's something going on with people that is affecting what happens after those encounters. And I think it is one area of research that needs to be explored among others.
Great. Okay. Thanks very much for that, Jennifer. And just to say, I'm going to bring things to a close, folks, because we just tipping over the time when we were planning to run till. So just to say thank you to all our speakers today who provided some really interesting input. We will, as I said, we're recording the session. We'll be at some point uploading it onto the CGA's YouTube channel, as well as the MMU Tube channel as well. So it'll be in two places where you can view it. We'll also download the chat afterwards, so we'll send that out to everybody who registered, and presumably you're all here because you registered, so that's fine, so you should get it. We'll also collect together all the presentations and we'll share that with you as well. Just give us a bit of time. It might take till next week to kind of get all that stuff together and send it to you. Of course, a big thank you to everyone who's attended and participated and put some really interesting questions, comments on the chat. Just before I finish, I'm sort of looking to Nina here. Did you have anything, Nina, you wanted to say at all to kind of finish off from the sort of CJA angle that I might have missed?
No, just again to echo you and just to thank all the speakers, and this is an ongoing area of work for the Criminal Justice Alliance, something that we're committed to taking forward over the next 2 years, supported by the Lloyds Bank Foundation. And so we'll be continuing with our series of responding restoratively briefings, touching on some different aspects of the criminal justice system. And so all the discussions and points that have been raised today will support that kind of ongoing advocacy and influencing work that we do around kind of policy practice and research. And yeah, please do get in contact with us, and we look forward to continuing this conversation. So thank you very much, everybody.
No, it's been great. We've had people attending from all sorts of places: Ireland, Latvia, I think in Australia, of course, South Africa. So and also I think Canada clearly, and parts of USA. So as well as the UK, of course. So a kind of multinational, international kind of seminar, which is great. So thanks to everybody. Can I just say, just an admin thing. So if Gavin, Anton and Nina just stay on afterwards, just so we can tidy up any kind of housekeeping stuff. But to everyone else, it's been great to have you at the seminar. I guess hope to see you soon, maybe at other sort of BJCAG events. And regardless of what time of day it is, hope you have a good rest of the day. Okay, so see you all soon. Thanks a lot, folks.
Thanks, Kevin. Bye.
So I think Anton's had to sort of head off actually, but just in terms of trying to pick
Just
up
going to
on.
stop recording now, actually. 1 second.
Yeah. Okay. Sure. Yeah.
Stop recording.
Okay.